lackeys in government have never been so shameless. There's more wars happening right now than any time since World War II. Governments everywhere are increasing military spending while cutting social services. And in country after country, there's rampant corruption and unemployment, poverty, inequality are growing day by day. People have had enough, and they're rising up in their millions. Mass movements and revolutions are sweeping across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even Europe. It is in this context that communists from across North America are gathering for the 16th annual Marxist Winter School, the biggest communist event on the continent. And this year's theme is reform or revolution. This is the burning question of our time. Because as the masses rise up and fight back, left-wing figures are emerging and promising bold reforms while keeping the capitalist system intact. But recent history shows us that as long as the capitalists and the banks continue to control the economy, the rich will just keep getting richer at society's expense, regardless of which party is in power. The masses need to overthrow capitalism and take power into their own hands. Every revolution presents an opportunity for them to do so. Revolution is coming to Canada, and there's already tens of thousands of communists across the country. But that's not going to cut it. To actually defeat this system, we need thousands of communist cadres that are capable of winning millions away from reformism to communist conclusions, and of guiding those millions to dismantle the capitalist system and help the working class take power. We need to train a new generation in the ideas required for victory. That's why at this year's Marxist Winter School, we're covering revolutionary history, past reformist experiments, and Marxist philosophy. If you want to end capitalism, you need to build yourself into a Marxist cadre. And before the revolution breaks out in Canada, we cannot afford to waste another opportunity to end the horrors of capitalism. So prepare for revolution and sign up today.
There were a lot of comments about fines in our last video, and fines are a real risk in an illegal strike, especially if you lose. But if we believe that the right to strike is something fundamental, that it's a constitutional right, as is always said in the labor movement, those fines should not hold. As unions love talking about legal challenges, they never talk about challenging fines. The reality is that fines are added to bargaining. Unions will say that we're not going back until you meet our demands and take these fines off. As one teacher I met said, we are the hostage takers in this scenario. A strike is a class struggle. And it's a struggle of living forces. It's not a series of legal measures. And a leadership with confidence in its membership and its ability to win is not scared of fines. When the demands of the strike are popular, as the demands of the teachers were, fines would only have the effect of throwing more gasoline on the fire. The ATA leadership should have said, fine us $1 trillion. We're not going back until we get class caps. But a leadership with no confidence in its membership or its ability to win is scared of fines. And in fact, they use fines as a stick to police the workers to going back to work. And this is what the ATA did. Compare what the ATA leadership says about fines to what Laura Walton says about fines. She was a rep for CUPE Ontario when they went on an illegal strike.
Province and do the work that they love.
The minister has made it clear he's going to fine your members $4,000 a day. Are you going to pay for that as the union? How is that going to work?
The fines can come and we will look after it. But how ridiculous is it that this minister is so concerned about pulling more money out of people who are impoverished instead of just sitting down and listening to what they need?
This will be an illegal strike, though. This is an illegal strike.
That's the great part about being part of a union and being part of the labor movement.
That's $1 billion in a week.
We understand that. We understand that.
Where's the money coming from?
That will be determined as we move forward. I can tell you right now that there is money coming in from other sources, including parents who are donating the $200 that they got from this government into the strike fund.
But this isn't sustainable for long, Laura.
You know what? At this point, there's a bigger problem on the horizon, and that is the mass exodus of education workers who can no longer afford to do the work that they love. You cannot fill a gas tank with passion. You need money. And you also need services coming in. We don't have enough EAs. We don't have enough custodians. There are schools being cleaned every other day. And there's nothing in this legislation that is going to happen that's going to make that any better.
We also got an anonymous submission on Instagram. I'm a teacher. In the meeting last night, Schilling's exact words for my human rights being stripped away were, quote, I know this is kind of crappy, but, end quote. Teachers have been abandoned, and so have our students. The majority of us were and are ready to defy. Alberta Teachers Union has capitulated. Danielle Smith gave the teachers every reason to defy. She invoked the notwithstanding clause and legislated a contract. When this happened in Ontario to QB education workers, it pushed them to go on an illegal strike.
Going on strike indefinitely. Please answer the question.
Yes!
And this is because it removes any role for unions to play. They can't bargain, they can't go on strike, they can't even file a lawsuit. The ATA was given two choices: defy or capitulate. They had all the momentum in the world. Just a few days ago, they held the largest demonstration in the history of the province. I spoke with around 100 teachers there, and probably 85% were in favor of defiance. The Common Front were making insinuations to a general strike. And yet, out of this situation, the ATA snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Whenever Schilling was asked how teachers would respond to back to work legislation, he said that they would have to evaluate it when they get it.
Again, we'll have to see what the bill says.
What was the point of being vague if they were going to roll over in the most egregious scenario? The email the ATA sent to their members says that they're going to launch a legal challenge. This is a cruel joke. The whole point of the notwithstanding clause is that it's notwithstanding your charter rights, and there's no basis for a challenge. Ever since Air Canada defied back to work legislation last August, governments have not used this legislation. If the ATA was going to have a chance, it needed to learn the lesson from the Air Canada strike. Back to work orders can be defeated with a strong lead. It can inspire people to fight for their rights. And this is not how you keep rights. You don't keep them by capitulating and rolling over when they're violated. You keep them by fighting for them and winning them. Instead, the leadership held a closed-door meeting, which is bullshit, by the way. There should have been general assemblies in every single local, in every school, to discuss and vote on whether or not teachers were going to abide by this legislation, on whether or not they were going to consent to having their rights revoked. Weeks ago, we called for the ATA to create democratic channels.
We must start preparing to defy back to work legislation. Democratic channels should be set up to allow teachers to discuss and vote on any attempts to force us back to work.
Instead, in a closed-door meeting, they decided to lose. The reality is, they could have won. They made the wrong decision, and public education will suffer for it. Kids will suffer. And these events show why we need a communist leadership of the labor movement. We've argued that we need to act decisively, that the strength of working class people comes from our ability to strike, our unity, and our numbers, and not from the element of surprise, that there's no need to be vague, and most importantly, that what we're fighting here is a class war. Danielle Smith is trying to make workers pay for the crisis of capitalism. You can email or write to UCP MLAs all you want. They are not collaborators, they are not our friends. They are class enemies. Schilling talked about wanting to be a partner with Danielle Smith.
I don't want to participate. I want to be a partner.
Her agenda is privatizing education. This is not something to be a partner with. And the only language these people recognize is force. They've dealt a forceful defeat to the teachers today. Tomorrow we need to inflict the same thing, but on them.
The only dangerous minority is the rich.
Yeah,
I think that's an excellent slogan.
it's a great slogan because it points it at the real.
It points it at the real enemy. It's like,
Yeah.
listen, the real enemy, the real reason our lives are shit, not because of the refugees.
Yeah.
It's not because of migrant workers. It's because of Bay Street.
Yeah.
It's because of Ottawa.
Yeah.
And it points the finger at the real enemy. I think any slogan that achieves that, this is a positive
Yeah.
slogan.
Like the class slogan.
It's a class
yeah.
slogan, which is, listen, you're right to feel this way. But what's actually causing this problem?
Yeah.
Why are grocery bills so high? Why is rent so high?
Yeah.
You know, why is the city falling apart? It's not because of immigrants. It's because of the rich and powerful, you know, the Gale and Westons,
Yeah,
the
the
Thompsons,
billionaires,
the
yeah.
Rogers family. These are the people who are ruining our lives, not the immigrants. And
most Trump voters don't want a culture war. They're not clamoring for ICE raids. They want better jobs, better working conditions. And that's why we don't fear MAGA. We don't fear right populism. We don't accept the culture war framing of it that says MAGA is the enemy. We don't accept the liberal alarmist attitude that says this is the beginning of a dictatorship. We explain we live under bourgeois democracy. This is a dictatorship of the rich already. The ruling class is the enemy. The capitalists, the bankers, the billionaires are the enemy. Their political parties, their institutions, their media are the enemy. And this is another element that separates us, the Revolutionary Communist International, from the prevalent outlook on the left that treats this global phenomenon of right populism as a rightward shift in society. if you adjust for inflation during the post-war boom, the median income of a 25-year-old with a high school diploma was making $10,000 more than what a 25-year-old is making on average in the US today. Not only that, they were getting ready to buy a house on average. The average home buyer was in their 20s. Again, inflation adjusted dollars, the median home value was $47,000. Young people aren't talking about buying homes today. They have no prospects for this. But the point is that over the last 50 years, the ruling class has squeezed this out of the hands of the working class. That has been taken from the proletariat into the pockets of the bourgeoisie. This is the class struggle over 50 years that's led to this. Meanwhile, the housing crisis has led to a spike in homelessness. We have the highest homelessness level in the US since World War II. Last year, at some point over the year, 1.5 million people had to sleep on the streets or in a shelter. At the height of the Great Depression, that reached 2 million. We're not that far off, comrades, from that level of misery. You don't need to be a Marxist to point out society is on the wrong track. Everyone can feel that. But you need to be a Marxist in order to explain what is the mechanism behind this. At the root, why exactly is capitalism in decline? And what does this mean? In this world of pessimistic doom, of sense of decline, Marxist perspectives alone provide revolutionary optimism, not because of mysticism or idealism or hopeful thinking. It's because of the materialist conception of history. We have optimism because we understand the process that is unfolding concretely beneath the events. We understand where this is going. It's not the beginning of dictatorship, it's a distraction. It's not fascism, it's a farce. He's not getting stronger, Trump is getting weaker, and Trump's base is abandoning him. On every single issue, his policies are backfiring. He's getting negative approval ratings. After all the shock and awe of the ICE raids, his handling of immigration is underwater by 8 points. After all this promise of the golden age of economic prosperity, his rating for jobs in the economy has been negative 22 points. Probably the most important factor is inflation. That's received the lowest approval rating of any issue, negative 34 points. So he sends in the troops to distract and to intimidate, and yet the locals in DC, they call them the National Gardeners because they're deployed on beautification missions to pick up trash and to plant flowers. Now the Democrats, they're rubbing their hands together with every move that Trump makes because they're hoping that this is going to help them in the midterms. But do they have any intention of fighting for the American working class? They have no intention of changing anything. They're playing the same game. Last week, the world has seen class politics come back to life. This is international class solidarity, a mass political general strike against imperialism. When is the last time we saw anything like this? Certainly it's been generations. And it's worth taking a moment to consider the scale of these remarkable events. You had 2 million people last Friday across 100 cities in Italy. Every major city and even small cities had massive demonstrations, and it's not just protests and marches. You have hundreds of thousands of people in the street, but it's the working class moving and seizing control of the means of production. Essentially, they're talking about blocking every harbor in Italy and the dock workers deciding what ships come, what ships get to dock, what ships don't. They're making the decisions. That is an element of workers' control. You had the largest demonstration in Rome in 50 years. The trade union leaders estimated there was up to 1 million people just in Rome alone. 150,000 in Milan, 150,000 in Bologna and Florence each. Demonstrations that were stretching 2.5 miles long as the procession's coming down the street. You can't even see the end of it. 80,000 people in Naples. The largest demonstrations they're saying in a lot of these cities in 25, 30 years. They blocked the roads, all the major highways, railways, of course the harbors, airlines, oil refineries, and you had participation in Italian industry, in the factories, of between 60 and 80%. So these streets are not just filled with random activists or students or demonstrators, all of the youth were out there as well. But you have metal workers and auto workers and teachers and firefighters and healthcare workers and airline workers organizing as workers. There's construction sites and the construction workers are waving to the procession going by and giving fists of solidarity and joining the procession. You had one sign in the street that said, "We wanted to liberate Palestine, and now Palestine is liberating us." Because the Italian working class for a long time has felt this growing discontent and has not found an outlet for that discontent. And now the struggle of Palestine is becoming the focal point. It's becoming the lightning rod that gives an expression to all of this. They're learning also from the movement in France. We've had several national strikes in France. Building on this movement, block everything. Bloquons tout. They've brought down the 5th prime minister that France has had in the last 2 years. Le Cornu, the last prime minister, he lasted for less than 14 hours. It was like 835 minutes. And luckily, Macron has appointed the 6th one yesterday. But someone, comrade, pointed out the French ruling class is literally out of ideas. They reappointed Le Cornu. So he's going to come back and give it another try. See if the French working class accepts it this time. They've been saying block everything, but how many times have we seen demonstrations that say shut it down? And people shout that into a megaphone, but what are they shutting down? And we've been pointing out, if you really want to shut it down, this is possible. But it's not going to happen by marching from point A to point B. And it's not going to happen just by shouting slogans in the streets. It needs to be a movement of the working class. And for a long time, people didn't understand what that could look like. Now they have a crystal clear image in front of them. This changes. This is the beginning of a new epoch of the class struggle in Italy, in Europe. This struggle is not going away. At the same time that the Italian working class was moving, you had 2 million people in Spain. 500,000 in Madrid alone, 300,000 in Barcelona. The Spanish working class is stirred by this. The youth are moving. 82% of the Spanish population recognizes Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide. This is the shift of public opinion dramatically on a global scale. Netherlands, in Amsterdam, that's a city of, within city limits, you have less than 1 million people. You had 250,000 demonstrating in Amsterdam. The drone footage, they call this the red line. If you look at the image, it gives you goosebumps. 250,000 people all wearing red as well. A massive, massive demonstration. And it's not just in a couple of these cities. Hundreds of thousands more in Ireland, Austria, Germany, Belgium, Denmark, Bulgaria, Finland, Poland, Portugal, Switzerland, Romania, Greece, Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia, Malaysia, Indonesia. I'm not talking about the last couple years or the last month. I'm talking about last Friday. A massive, massive demonstration in response. I mean, the tipping point was the IDF's attack on the global Sumud Gaza Solidarity Flotilla that was trying to break Israel's blockade and deliver humanitarian aid. I think you all know that the IDF seized the boats and arrested 450 activists from 44 countries, brutalized these activists. They denied them food and water. You know, Greta Thunberg and a lot of other public figures were on these, and the IDF soldiers they forced Greta Thunberg to kiss an Israeli flag, and they wrapped her up in it and marched her around to parade her. What force acts like this? A force that is used to acting with impunity. A force that's used to doing whatever it wants, with no force out there to say, you can't cross this line. But the workers of the world are seeing this. The workers of the world are drawing the line now. World sentiment has turned against the Zionist state. Anti-imperialism is coming forward. This disgust at genocidal crimes. Israel has become isolated on the world stage, and US imperialism is increasingly isolated on the world stage. Marco Rubio said just a week ago, we cannot ignore the impact that this has had on Israel's global standing. Trump just last Saturday says, Bibi has gone too far in Gaza, and Israel has lost a lot of support in the world. Now I will return all that support. I can make a prediction right now. He's not going to return that support. Phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement has been agreed to, but there's a lot of other phases here. Phase 1 has been the easy part. There's no guarantee that this is going to carry out. And certainly what it doesn't guarantee is that there's going to be any resolution or any stability in the region. The question of the oppression of the Palestinian people has not been resolved. But the Italian working class has showed the world that this is a working class issue. This is not just some faraway crime against humanity to be decried in humanitarian terms. This is part of a class war that is being waged against the workers of the world, because every Western government and many beyond are aiding and abetting Israel's crimes while they are attacking the workers at home. Suffering at home is allowing suffering abroad to take place. And the dock workers pointed this out. They said, we have the power. Actually, the Italian dock workers organized an international meeting of dock workers of the rest of Europe and said, we have it in our power to decide what docks, what gets shipped, what gets loaded, and what doesn't. And so they're making it a working class issue. This is a remarkable confirmation of the perspectives of this international, because they're showing that in practice, these are the methods that we've advocated. It shows that all along what was needed was a spark, some organized force to say, this is the way that we can mobilize. This is the power of the working class. Here's how we use it. And they gave the right call at the right time. And it wasn't just a random group of activists from the outside. It was organized workers. It was these dock workers saying, if they touch the flotilla, we're going to shut it down. And we're not just saying we're going to shut it down into a megaphone. we're going to paralyze the economy. And they begin with the docks. And they call on mass solidarity from the local population. And big demonstrations come up and back up the dock workers. And they do begin to shut it down. And that movement begins to spread. And initially, the CGIL, which is the National Federation of Trade Unions in Italy, it's like the AFL-CIO in the US. They have 5 million workers. It's a very conservative leadership. This is the establishment labor leaders. Initially, they opposed it. They had no intention of calling a general strike. But the movement from below forced them to. It forced them to get on board. The pressure that they were feeling from their own ranks forced their hand, and suddenly this 5 million strong union confederation is calling for an official general strike. And that is the way that you mobilize the mass of the working class. It cannot be done by a small minority. It cannot be done from the outside. It needs to be done from the top. It needs to be done from the organizations of the working class. And this shows how this can happen. Now, of course, this hasn't happened in the US yet, but it can, and it will. That's the lesson of these events, is that before the Italian workers moved, you could have looked at that situation on the surface and say, why are people not moving? Why is there so much apathy? But the discontent was building below. It was waiting for an outlet. As soon as the outlet's provided, you see this explosion of a social wildfire. That is waiting to happen in the United States as well. Now, we have a very passive, conservative labor leadership in this country. An incredibly pathetic labor leadership that has overseen a decades-long decline. And the apparent ebb in the Palestine solidarity movement in this country is largely due to that, to the role of the labor leaders. But that dam of silence and inaction, that can be broken. Those floodgates can be broken. And then everything can be ignited. That's the lessons of this.
Okay, my name is Dan Baker. This channel is Comrade Meow's audiobooks, and I'm about to read from What is Marxism? I'm a combat veteran of the YPG International Volunteers, where I fought against ISIS. You can Google me. You can Google the YPG. And I am now a sympathizer of the Revolutionary Communists of America, who wrote this book, What is Marxism? By Alan Woods and Rob Sewell. I am in the chapter, What is Marxist Economics? And I'm in the section, Profits and Productivity. The drive of the capitalist is to make money. When a capitalist introduces new production techniques and produces commodities below the average cost of production, then he will be able to sell more goods more cheaply and make super profits. That is, until everyone else follows suit and also introduces the new technique. Once this happens and the new level of technique becomes the average, the price falls to a new level to correspond with the new socially necessary labor time. Each commodity now takes less time to produce and therefore contains less value than before, thereby effectively reducing its cost and its price. Of course, socially necessary labor time is always changing with the constant changes in technique. However, there exists a general average standard at any point, which is in turn superseded in a never-ending process of technical advance. Capitalism is an anarchic system. There is no planning whatsoever once the goods enter the market. Here the blind forces of the market dominate. If a capitalist produces 1,000 beds for a sale at 100 pounds each, but finds that other capitalists, more than usual, have done the same, he will fear that not all his beds will be sold. He then reduces his price to undermine his competitors, but the others follow suit. With prices falling, people who did not intend to buy now become interested. As the price falls, demand increases. In this case, either some beds will remain unsold or the price of each bed will be lower than usual. Instead of making 100,000 pounds as he expected, he has to settle for, say, 70,000 pounds. However, the capitalist making wardrobes has fared better. There were fewer sellers, but many people who were interested in buying wardrobes. The wardrobes that were normally selling for 200 pounds were being lapped up. The capitalists then raised their prices. As this happened, fewer people buy the wardrobes. There is a limit to what the prices can be raised if they are all to be sold. The price rose to 300 pounds. At the end of the day, our capitalist sold all his wares and made 150,000 pounds from the sales. The capitalists making the beds saw the profits being made by those making wardrobes. In the end, more and more began to switch their production to more profitable wardrobe protection, rather than making beds. In other words, capital flows to those sections of the economy that offer the highest rates of return. But as new capacity comes on stream, the production of wardrobes increases and the price of wardrobes falls, as well as the profits. As a consequence, capital then seeks out areas of higher rates of profit, possibly in bed production, which now experiences shortages and thus a rise in the price of beds. As one opportunity opens up, another one closes. This results in a new division of labor in society. Reflecting the changes in prices and demands. While the value of a commodity, based upon the socially necessary labor time needed for its production, is not immediately visible, prices certainly are. Walk into any shop and all the goods have price tags. While commodities of equal value tend to have equal exchange value and prices, this is not always the case. In fact, in most cases, they don't. Indeed, the law of value would not operate unless price did not differ from values. A new division of labor and allocation of resources arises from the prices rising above or falling below values, in response to changes in the supply and demand for particular goods. So prices do not, on all occasions, reflect values, but tend to orbit around the value of a commodity. This fluctuation of prices can be compared to sea levels. When the tide ebbs and flows, it nevertheless has a certain reference point, a certain average level around which the sea rises and falls. The variation arises from the fact that the sea is in constant motion and affected by gravitational pull. Nevertheless, there is a certain level, the sea level, around which these ebbs and flows take place. In regard to the economy, whatever the degree of divergence individually, the sum of all prices is equal to the sum of all values. Trotsky explained, "For in the final reckoning, only the values that have been created by human labor are at the disposal of society, and prices cannot break through this limitation, including even the monopoly of prices of trusts, where labor has created no new value. There even Rockefeller can get nothing." Through this means, the law of value determines the ratios of commodities that need to be produced and the distribution of labor power throughout the various sectors of the economy. This demonstrates how the law of value operates, through price signals and market forces as the basic regulator of the capitalist system. It is worthwhile underlying the difference, which is often muddled, between material wealth and value. Value is a social and historical category, which is only valid as long as commodity and production exists. When commodity production disappears, and we have production for need, value will also disappear. This takes place under socialist society. Wealth, on the other hand, is something material and consists of use values, irrespective of the form of society. All things being equal, a rise in the productivity of labor will generate a rise in the material wealth of society. More clothes, cars, TV sets, houses, etc. However, the total amount of existing values may at the same time remain unchanged, provided that the quantity of labor expended is the same. If a car worker produces 100 car engines instead of 50 in the space of 8 hours, still 8 hours labor would be spent in their production. One car would now incorporate half the value or labor time as before. Again, a favorable harvest increases the wealth of a country, but the total values represented by a harvest would remain the same if the amount of socially necessary labor expended remained unaltered. The bourgeois critics take delight in pointing to such apparent contradictions in Marx without understanding Marx's scientific method of analysis. Incapable of answering him, they instead prefer to distort and twist everything he says. All they are interested in is the market and market relations, which constitute the surface appearance of capitalist economic relations. The constant drive of the capitalists to keep up with socially necessary labor time also explains why capitalism cannot exist without continually revolutionizing the mode of production. In its turn, the introduction of machinery, together with an expansion of capital, means an increase in the productivity of labor. Marx states, quote, "The development of capitalist production makes it constantly necessary to keep increasing the amount of capital laid out in a given industrial undertaking. And competition makes the immanent laws of capitalist production to be felt by each individual capitalist. As eternal coercive laws, it compels him to keep constantly expanding his capital in order to preserve it. But extend it he cannot, except by means of progressive accumulation." Marx never said that the exchange value was the only thing that determined price. He did not deny the effects of supply and demand on price. Neither did he deny the existence of monopoly prices. He drew the distinction between value and price and recognized that a price tag can be applied to anything, including things that have no value whatsoever. Things such as a virgin land can be priced and sold for enormous amounts of money. Rare works of art are sold for millions far beyond their original intrinsic value, due to the frenzied speculation of those with money keen to invest in these unique artifacts. With supply limited to a single object, individual Rembrandt paintings can be sold for a fortune. The only thing that determines their price is the amount that the super rich are prepared to pay. Works of art cannot be produced or reproduced, except as inferior imitations, and therefore such things are unique one-off things. This monopoly situation has a direct bearing on their price or what people are prepared to pay. If the item is of one kind, the restricted supply means it can attract an astronomical price. Such examples, despite the rational explanations, have been used to attack the labor theory of value. However, these attacks are groundless. In practice, unique things such as original classical paintings lie beyond the realm of the labor theory of value, which deals with commodities that can be reproduced without limitations or restrictions. Otherwise, what we are dealing with here are monopoly prices. Economic textbooks will tell you that all prices are determined by supply and demand, but this is only partly true. Of course, a corner shop can charge customers more for things at midnight, as either you buy or you go home empty-handed. While the price of beans can rise very high for reasons of scarcity, it can only rise within limits. But whatever the cost of bread or baked beans, they will always be less than a tractor. While prices may vary due to supply and demand, they will always hover around an axis, namely the value of a commodity. That is why certain commodities, like a tin of baked beans, will always be cheaper than commodities that contain a higher labor time expended on their production, whether it is a car or a tractor. Increased prices will, as explained, cause capital to flow into this sector, attracted by high profits, and will increase the future production of baked beans, thereby reducing their size. Such a process takes place across the entire economy. This demonstrates the fluctuation of market prices, but still leaves the question of what it is that lies beyond these prices. For Marx, the answer is the labor theory of value. As for bourgeois economists, they simply ignore this question, as they do not want to be seen to justify such heretical ideas. Utility theory. The economic categories used by Marx are, of course, rejected wholesale by today's bourgeois economists, whose role it is to disguise and cover up exploitation that exists. The concepts of Marx are anathema to them. The Austrian School of Economics was the chief artillery of the bourgeois counteroffensive against Marxism. For them, wages were simply regarded as part of the national income, along with rent, interest, and profit. Labor had no special place in production, and surplus value for them did not exist. Their concept of value was not based on any objective criteria, but simply expressed a subjective choice or wishful thinking. In the words of Reverend Archbishop Whately, it is not that pearls fetch a high price because men have dived for them, but on the contrary, men dive for them because they fetch a high price. In fact, the high price of pearls arises from the difficult labor involved in retrieving them, and their high value spurs people to engage in this activity. Our Archbishop is blind to the essential question, what is the value of a pearl and how is it determined? Marx explains the reason in regard to diamonds. Diamonds are a very rare occurrence on Earth's surface, and hence their discovery costs on average a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small compass. The same can be said of pearls. Personal note, it's crazy now because there's pearl farms where they're oyster farming and intentionally cultivating pearls inside oysters and then harvesting them. And they do it live on TikTok. And they're also manufacturing diamonds, synthetic diamonds, and that drives down the price of diamonds. So all of these people who sacrificed against their will their lives to harvest pearls, and authors like John Steinbeck wrote about these people who were diving for pearls and sacrificing, so much time and energy in their lives and limbs, fighting sharks to reach these pearls. And now they're making pearls in oyster farms, and that drives down the prices of pearls for the poor people who are actually still diving for them. And all of these people who were forced to mine for diamonds, now they're making synthetic diamonds. And the whole system is totally corrupt and ridiculous. But you have people who are being forced, their consent is manufactured because they're living in a colonized place, and they have to go mine for diamonds at gunpoint, or they have to go dive for oysters to dig up real pearls. And then, these rich people who have a bunch of capital are buying an oyster farm and manufacturing pearls, and buying a laboratory and manufacturing diamonds. And, they're selling diamonds and pearls at cheaper prices. And it's just a disgusting system. Going on. While Marx regards the value as an objective thing, the advocates of marginal utility theory regard it as a subjective question. They place the whole business on its head in an idealist fashion. This is what takes place. This was then taken up by later economists and became the basis of modern bourgeois economy. At this point, bourgeois economics ceased to be a science. Its whole purpose was simply to justify the capitalist system. According to them, if someone wants something badly, it has considerable utility for that person. The more he wants it, the more he is willing to pay for it. It depends on your point of view, namely how much satisfaction a person gets from consuming a certain commodity. Oddly, while it is possible to see that the same commodity has different amounts of utility for different people, it nevertheless sells in a supermarket at the same price. This means that price cannot be subjective, but must be based upon a real foundation of value. If utility is supposed to measure value, how is it that different amounts of utility are sold for the same price? They attempt to get around this contradiction by reference to the margin, and in economic textbooks, to marginal utility. But we will leave this realm of idealist fantasy. Labor power and wages. Under feudal society, the extent of exploitation is very clear for all to see. The serfs work on their own land to grow the crops for themselves and their families. They then work on the lord's land to produce a surplus that is appropriated by the lord. Both are separated by time and place. Under slavery, surplus labor is not performed in this way. The illusion is created that the slave owner takes everything. In fact, the slave has to eat in order to work. The slave owner must provide this. Therefore, some slave labor is necessary labor to cover their keep, while the remainder is surplus labor taken by the owner. Under capitalism, exploitation is hidden, as necessary and surplus labor are not separated in time and place. The whole process is shrouded in a veil. But Marx shows how surplus value under capitalism is produced. He explains that the capitalist finds in the marketplace a particular commodity, which unlike all other commodities is the source of values greater than its own value. This commodity is called labor power. This labor power is the ability to work using brain and muscle. Marx defined it as the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in a human being. The purchase and use of these mental and physical abilities, all the effort and strain that goes into the laboring process when put to work by the capitalist, constitutes the exploitation of the working class. The capitalist squeezes out every ounce of energy from the worker during every minute of the working day. What is the price of labor power, or the value of wages paid to workers? Human labor power is a commodity like any other. Like all commodities, this value is determined by the labor time socially necessary for its production. Labor power is directly linked to the well-being of working people. They need food, clothing, housing, etc. to survive and be fit for work the next day. This must also include the upkeep of the family, the next generation of workers. Workers also need to be educated and trained. Therefore, the value of labor power is determined by the value of the means of subsistence, namely, the means by which labor power is reproduced. In addition, there is also a historical element, depending on time and place. And that's funny because these days they don't even pay people enough to reproduce, and people are refusing to have kids because they can't afford to raise them. And nobody wants to have kids just to have them taken away by the state because they've been quote unquote neglected, because even though the parents work 2 or 3 jobs, no job is giving people full-time hours and benefits. Continuing, wages, the price of labor power, are regarded as the going rate for the job. However, the capitalist is interested in keeping wages as low as possible. The workers have the opposite need. Wages, the price of labor power, can therefore fluctuate to a certain extent according to the struggle of living forces, i.e. the class struggle. After purchasing labor power for a certain wage, the capitalist proceeds to put his hired hands to work. While the worker has a contract to work for, say 8 hours, they cover the value of their wages in perhaps only 4 hours. This initial period Marx describes as necessary labor time. This is where the worker produces values equivalent to the extent of the means of subsistence necessary for the reproduction of their labor power. But once having covered the value of their wages, the worker does not stop work, but continues until the end of their 8-hour shift. This extra period beyond the necessary part is called surplus labor time, and is where the worker produces surplus value for the capitalist. This 4-hour period is unpaid labor, and is where capitalist profits come from. Raw materials and the tools used up in the production of the commodity do not create new value, but simply transfer their existing value to the new product. This includes the wear and tear of the machines, which only gradually transfer their value, known as depreciation. Labor, combined with nature, is the source of all new value. Including surplus value. A machine simply increases the productivity of human labor, which allows the effort of the workers to produce more in a given time. However, it is not the machine that creates the new value, but the labor of the workers. All the existing value from past labor contained in the raw materials, the wear and tear, etc., is transferred to the new commodities created by the worker. The transferred value is referred to by Marx as dead labor, as opposed to the new value that has been added, which Marx describes as living labor. He compares it to a blood-sucking vampire. Capital is dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor, and lives more the more labor it sucks. The overriding driving factor of capitalism is the production of surplus value. The capitalist is determined to squeeze the last drop of profit from the unpaid labor of the working class. He does this through a combination of ways: lengthening the working day, speeding up the machines, introducing labor-saving machines, rationalization, productivity deals, new shifts, time and motion studies, lean production techniques. There is a whole host of these things which workers have become very familiar with, especially over the past period of years. The total capital invested by the capitalist was divided by Marx into two parts. The capital made up of means of production, raw materials, power, etc., is deemed constant capital, as it simply transfers its value to the new commodities. The value they impart is fixed. However, the capital represented by labor power, the cost of wages, is regarded as variable capital, and it is the source of all new additional value. The amount of value it imparts is not fixed, but expanding, thus the name variable. Therefore, total capital can be presented as C plus V, where C is the constant part and V is the variable. It follows that the total value of all commodities is made up of C plus V plus S, where S represents the surplus value. During the production process, surplus value S is created. During the production process, surplus value S is created. As the surplus value is locked up inside the commodity, the capitalist can only obtain or realize this surplus value when the commodities are sold on the market. Thus, while surplus value is created in production, it can only be realized in exchange in the marketplace. If a commodity cannot be sold, it cannot realize its surplus value and is worthless. The capitalist class forces the working class to perform more labor than required to cover their means of subsistence, thus producing surplus value. The capitalists are constantly seeking to increase the rate of surplus value, that is, the amount of surplus value that can be produced for a given quantity of purchased labor power. This rate of surplus value can be expressed in terms of the ratio of surplus labor to necessary labor, or S/V. In simple terms, it is the rate of exploitation of labor by capital, of the worker by the capitalist. The capitalists increase this rate of exploitation by lengthening the working day through overtime and shift work. Many industries work on a 24-hour basis, forcing its workers to follow suit. While labor is the source of value, there are physical limits to its exploitation. A worker may be able to work 8, 10, or 12 hours a day, but they have to eat and sleep in order to be revived for the next working day. Workers also have to travel to work, which may take 2 hours or more on top of this. So despite the demands of capitalism for 24-hour production, there is nevertheless a barrier to the amount of surplus value that can be physically extracted in a 24-hour period. I work at Waffle House as a line cook. You could also say I'm a professional fighter at Waffle House. And it's a 24-hour situation, which I can relate to all this. They want to squeeze as much work out of you while paying you as little as possible. That's why Waffle House hires felons, because felons have restricted options for jobs, so Waffle House can negotiate a lower wage. While labor is the source of value, there are physical limits to exploitation. Oh, we just read this. Nevertheless, the struggle to lengthen the working day is an ongoing battle. Such exploitation produces, according to Marx, absolute surplus value. Since there are limits to lengthening the working day, the capitalists revert to measures to increase the intensification of labor. New machines are introduced to speed up the production process. The continuous increase of the intensity of labor becomes the means of reproducing the value of machinery, constant capital, in the shortest period of time. Workers are forced to work harder in a shorter space of time. Marx calls this the production of relative surplus value. Again, a living example of this is DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, etc. When you work at a 24-hour restaurant, people are already calling in online orders, and people are coming in at all hours of the day and night to eat or just get coffee or get out of the heat or the cold inside. And when you work at Waffle House 24 hours a day, and then they have online orders, now you've got, on top of a 24-hour situation of walk-in customers, you've got online orders and delivery drivers showing up to pick up these online orders. And then you have a backup of orders. You have to make all of these orders as quickly as possible because the delivery has to be fast. But you've got real life people staring at you like, hey, where's my order? And that's an example of a speed up situation under capitalism, where the capitalists are trying to squeeze as much labor as possible out of a limited situation where you can only make so much food per hour while it's still quality and safe. Quoting Marx now, "There cannot be the slightest doubt that the tendency that urges capital, so soon as the prolongation of the hours of labor is once and for all forbidden, to compensate itself by a systematic heightening of the intensity of labor, and to convert every improvement in machinery into a more perfect means of exhausting the workman, must soon lead to a state of things in which the reduction of the hours of labor will again be inevitable." Again, they cut everybody's hours. Nobody gets full-time at Waffle House, even though it's a 24-hour place and they could give us all full-time hours. They have everybody working short shifts back to back, and everyone's in competition trying to get more hours or work at multiple stores. The capitalists, however, will never shorten the working day of their own account, for they will never voluntarily renounce their surplus value. Only the struggle of the working class can hope to bring this about. It is in the class struggle that decides this. Of course, the capitalists seek to conceal the system of exploitation. They maintain that they buy the workers' labor rather than the workers' labor power, but this is not the case. The capitalists would not employ workers unless they could make a profit from them, and the unpaid labor of the workers is the source of the profit. They therefore pay in wages less than the worker produces in value. The circulation of money as capital may be described as MCM, where money, capital, M, is turned into commodities, C. Money is turned into commodities, MC, which are then sold for more money, M. Marx calls this the general formula for capital, where M exceeds M. The difference between M and M, the value gained by the capitalist, is surplus value. So M becomes C, where you get surplus value and then is sold for more M, right? MCM is money, commodities, money. While exploitation is transparent under feudalism, as the serf labors on the lord's land for free for so many days, under capitalism, surplus and necessary labor performed by the worker are not separated in time and space, and therefore the exploitation of workers is not so obvious. The exploitation is the same, but the mode of exploitation is different. Marx explains the essential difference between the various economic forms of society between, for instance, a society based on slave labor and one based on wage labor lies only in the mode in which this surplus labor is in each case extracted from the actual producer, the laborer. So we'll stop there for now. Basically, these days, if you work for an hourly wage, you are a wage slave. And that's the reality of the situation. So now I'm going to sit and meditate on these ideas while listening to an audiobook on the same topics by Lenin about, once the workers realize these things, how do we put a solution forth? And that solution cannot be found in reformation and reforms through the electoral process, through the political process within the system, that's never going to work. What works is revolution. And that is what the authorities do not want you to know or think about.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of the International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart, as published in Proletary 1907 by Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this is an audiobook and discussion of the International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart by Lenin. It was written at the end of August and beginning of September 1907, published in Proletary number 17, October 20, 1907, and published according to that newspaper text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 13, pages 75 to 81. It was translated by Bernard Isaacs, HTML markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to Marxists Internet Archive for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's get into the audiobook. A feature of the International Socialist Congress held in Stuttgart this August was its large and representative composition. The total of 886 delegates came from all the 5 continents. Besides providing an impressive demonstration of international unity in the proletarian struggle, the Congress played an outstanding part in defining the tactics of the socialist parties. It adopted general resolutions on a number of questions, the decision of which had hitherto been left solely to the discretion of the individual socialist parties. And the fact that more and more problems require uniform, principled decisions in different countries is striking proof that socialism is being welded into a single international force. Quick comment, boy do I wish we could say that today. Continuing. The full text of the Stuttgart resolutions will be found elsewhere in this issue. We shall deal briefly with each of them in order to bring out the chief controversial points and the character of the debate at the Congress. This is not the first time the colonial question has figured at international congresses. Up till now, their decisions have always been an unqualified condemnation of bourgeois colonial policy as a policy of plunder and violence. This time, however, the Congress Commission was so composed that opportunist elements, headed by Van Cole of Holland, predominated in it. A sentence was inserted in the draft resolution to the effect that the Congress did not, in principle, condemn all colonial policy, for under socialism, colonial policy could play a civilizing role. The minority in the commission, led de Boer of Germany, the Polish and Russian Social Democrats, and many others, vigorously protested against any such idea being entertained. The matter was referred to Congress, where the forces of the two trends were found to be so nearly equal that there was an extremely heated debate. The opportunists rallied behind Van Cole. Speaking for the majority of the German delegation, Bernstein and David urged acceptance of a socialist colonial policy and fulminated against the radicals for their barren, negative attitude, their failure to appreciate the importance of reforms, their lack of a practical colonial program, etc. Incidentally, they were opposed by Kautsky, who felt compelled to ask the Congress to pronounce against the majority of the German delegation. He rightly pointed out that there was no question of rejecting the struggle for reforms that was explicitly stated in other sections of the resolution, which had evoked no dispute. The point at issue was whether we should make concessions to the modern regime of bourgeois plunder and violence. The Congress was to discuss present-day colonial policy, which was based on the downright enslavement of primitive populations. The bourgeoisie was actually introducing slavery in the colonies and subjecting the native populations to unprecedented outrages and acts of violence, quote, civilizing them by the spread of liquor and syphilis. And in that situation, socialists were expected to utter evasive phrases about the possibility of accepting colonial policy in principle. That would be an outright desertion to the bourgeois point of view. It would be a decisive step towards subordinating the proletariat to bourgeois ideology, to bourgeois imperialism, which is now arrogantly raising its head. The Congress defeated the Commission's motion by 128 votes to 108, with 10 abstentions from Switzerland. It should be noted that at Stuttgart, for the first time, each nation was allotted a definite number of votes, varying from 20 for the big nations, Russia included, to 2, Luxembourg. The combined vote of the small nations, which either do not pursue a colonial policy or which suffer from it, outweighed the vote of nations where even the proletariat has been somewhat infected with the lust of conquest. This vote on the colonial question is of very great importance. First, it strikingly showed up socialist opportunism, which succumbs to bourgeois blandishments. Secondly, it revealed a negative feature in the European labor movement, one that can do no little harm to the proletarian cause, and for that reason should receive serious attention. Marx frequently quoted a very significant saying of Sismondi: "The proletarians of the ancient world," this saying runs, "lived at the expense of society. Modern society lives at the expense of the proletarians." The non-propertied but non-working class is incapable of overthrowing the exploiters. Only the proletarian class, which maintains the whole of society, can bring about the social revolution. However, as a result of the extensive colonial policy, the European proletarian partly finds himself in a position when it is not his labor, but the labor of the practically enslaved natives in the colonies that maintains the whole of society. The British bourgeoisie, for example, derives more profit from the many millions of the population of India and other colonies than from the British workers. In certain countries, this provides the material and economic basis for infecting the proletariat with colonial chauvinism. Of course, this may only be a temporary phenomenon, but the evil must nonetheless be clearly realized, and its causes understood in order to be able to rally the proletariat of all countries for the struggle against such opportunism. This struggle is bound to be victorious, since the, quote, privileged nations are a diminishing faction of the capitalist nations. There were practically no differences at the Congress on the question of women's suffrage. The only one who tried to make out a case for a socialist campaign in favor of a limited women's suffrage, qualified as opposed to universal suffrage, was a woman delegate from the extremely opportunist British Fabian Society. No one supported her. Her motives were simple enough. British bourgeois ladies hoped to obtain the franchise for themselves without its extension to women workers in Britain. The first International Socialist Women's Conference was held concurrently with the Congress in the same building. Both at this conference and in the Congress Commission, there was an interesting dispute between the German and Austrian Social Democrats on the draft resolution. In their campaign for universal suffrage, the Austrians tended to play down the demand for equal rights of men and women. On practical grounds, they placed the main emphasis on male suffrage. Clara Zetkin and other German Social Democrats rightly pointed out to the Austrians that they were acting incorrectly, and that by failing to press the demand that the vote be granted to women as well as to men, they were weakening the mass movement. The concluding words of the Stuttgart Resolution, quote, "The demand for universal suffrage should be put forward simultaneously for both men and women," unquote, undoubtedly relate to this episode of excessive practicalism in the history of the Austrian labor movement. The resolution on the relations between the socialist parties and the trade unions is of especial importance to us Russians. The Stockholm RSDLP Congress went on record for non-party unions, thus endorsing the neutrality standpoint, which has always been upheld by our non-party Democrats, Bernsteinians, and socialist revolutionaries. The London Congress, on the other hand, put forward a different principle, namely, closer alignment of the unions with the party, even including, under certain conditions, their recognition as party unions. At Stuttgart, in the Social Democratic subsection of the Russian section, the socialists of each country form a separate section at international congresses. Opinion was divided on this issue. There was no split on other issues. Plekhanov upheld the neutrality principle. Voinov, a Bolshevik, defended the anti-neutralist viewpoint of the London Congress and of the Belgian resolution, published in the Congress materials with de Brucker's support, which will soon appear in Russian. Clara Zetkin rightly remarked in her journal Die Gleichheit that Plekhanov's arguments for neutrality were just as lame as those of the French. And the Stuttgart Resolution, as Kautsky rightly observed, and as anyone who takes the trouble to read it carefully will see, puts an end to recognition of the neutrality principle. There is not a word in it about neutrality or non-party principles. On the contrary, it definitely recognizes the need for closer and stronger connections between the unions and the socialist parties. The resolution of the London RSDLP Congress on the trade unions has thus been placed on a firm theoretical basis in the form of the Stuttgart Resolution. The Stuttgart Resolution lays down the general principle that in every country the unions must be brought into permanent and close contact with the Socialist Party. The London Resolution says that in Russia this should take the form, under favorable conditions, of party unions, and party members must work towards that goal. We note that the harmful aspects of the neutrality principle were revealed in Stuttgart by the fact that the trade union half of the German delegation were the most adamant supporters of opportunist views. That is why in Essen, for example, the Germans were against Van Kool. The trade unions were not represented in Essen, which was a congress solely of the party, while in Stuttgart they supported him. By playing into the hands of the opportunists in the social democratic movement, the advocacy of neutrality in Germany has actually had harmful results. This is a fact that should not be overlooked, especially in Russia, where the bourgeois democratic councillors of the proletariat, who urge it to keep the trade union movement neutral, are so numerous. A few words about the resolution on emigration and immigration. Here too, in the Commission, there was an attempt to defend narrow, craft interest, to ban the immigration of workers from backward countries, coolies from China, etc. This is the same spirit of aristocratism, labor aristocracy, that one finds among workers in some of the, quote, civilized countries who derive certain advantages from their privileged position and are therefore inclined to forget the need for international class solidarity. But no one at the Congress defended this craft and petty bourgeois narrow-mindedness. The resolution fully meets the demands of revolutionary social democracy. We pass now to the last and perhaps the most important resolution of the Congress, that on anti-militarism. The notorious Hervé, who has made such a noise in France and Europe, advocated a semi-anarchist view by naively suggesting that every war be answered by a strike and an uprising. He did not understand, on the one hand, that war is a necessary product of capitalism, and that the proletariat cannot renounce participation in revolutionary wars, for such wars are possible, and indeed have occurred in capitalist societies. He did not understand, on the other hand, that the possibility of answering a war depends on the nature of the crisis created by that war. The choice of the means of struggle depends on these conditions. Moreover, the struggle must consist, and here we have the third misconception, or shallow thinking of Hervéism, not simply in replacing war by peace, but in replacing capitalism by socialism. The essential thing is not merely to prevent war, but to utilize the crisis created by war in order to hasten the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Quick comment, this is absolutely what happened in the Russian Revolution, right at the end of World War I, is when that happened. The wars destabilized the capitalist countries. That's why you see the Russian Revolution after World War I, and then at the end of World War II, all kinds of revolutions in Eastern Europe, and then of course the revolution in China following very closely after that. So this is key. Continuing. However, underlying all these semi-anarchist absurdities of Hervéism, there was one sound and practical purpose: to spur the socialist movement so that it will not be restricted to parliamentary methods of struggle alone, so that the masses will realize the need for revolutionary action in connection with the crises which war inevitably involves, so that lastly, a more lively understanding of international labor solidarity and of the falsity of bourgeois patriotism will be spread among the masses. Bebel's resolution, moved by the Germans and coinciding in all essentials with Gesda's resolution, had one shortcoming. It failed to indicate the active tasks of the proletariat. This made it possible to read Bebel's orthodox propositions through opportunist spectacles, and Volmar was quick to turn this possibility into a reality. That is why Rosa Luxemburg and the Russian Social Democratic delegates moved their amendments to Bebel's resolution. These amendments, 1, stated that militarism is the chief weapon of class oppression, 2, pointed out the need for propaganda among the youth. 3. Stressed that Social Democrats should not only try to prevent war from breaking out or to secure the speediest termination of wars that have already begun, but should utilize the crisis created by the war to hasten the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. The subcommission, elected by the Anti-Militarism Commission, incorporated all these amendments in Bebel's resolution. In addition, Jarre made this happy suggestion: instead of enumerating the methods of struggle, strikes, uprisings, the resolution should cite historical examples of proletarian action against war, from the demonstrations in Europe to the revolution in Russia. The result of all this redrafting was a resolution which, it is true, is unduly long, but is rich in thought and precisely formulates the tasks of the proletariat. It combines the stringency of orthodox, i.e., the only scientific Marxist analysis, with recommendations for the most resolute and revolutionary action by the workers' parties. This resolution cannot be interpreted a la Volmar, nor can it be fitted into the narrow framework of naive Hervéism. On the whole, the Stuttgart Congress brought into sharp contrast the opportunist and revolutionary wings of the international social democratic movement on a number of cardinal issues, and decided these issues in the spirit of revolutionary Marxism. Its resolutions and the report of the debates should become a handbook for every propagandist. The work done at Stuttgart will greatly promote the unity of tactics and unity of revolutionary struggle of the proletarians of all countries. So that's the end of the audiobook. There's a few notes here. The International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart, or the 7th Congress of the Second International, was held from August 18 to 24, 1907. The RSDLP, or the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, was represented at it by 37 delegates. Among the Bolshevik delegates attending the Congress were Lenin, Lunacharsky, and Litvinov. The Congress considered the following questions: 1. Militarism and international conflicts. 2. Relations between the political parties and the trade unions. That was all the stuff about neutrality. 3. The colonial question. 4. Immigration and emigration of workers. And 5. Women's suffrage. The main work of the Congress was in the committees, where resolutions were drafted for the plenary sessions. Lenin was on the Militarism and International Conflicts Committee. So this is in 1907, 2 years after the first Russian Revolution of 1905, after which they started setting up some of the first Soviets. While the revolution was not entirely successful, it was a step forward for the socialist movement. And this report from Lenin sounds like it was an interesting and fairly harmonious time, noting, of course, some of the opportunism that was witnessed at this. What is opportunism, by the way? In Marxist terminology, it's when socialists go along with bourgeois interests, basically. It's hitching your wagon to capitalist political interests, so something we want to avoid, definitely. I will get a copy of the resolutions themselves and do those on the channel as a follow-up. We've been doing a lot of this pre-1917 writings of Lenin here on the channel. I think that it's possible to me that the US may be in a similar type of position. If there's any lessons that we can learn, I would love to learn them as soon as possible. So that for me is where a lot of these are coming from. Anyway, that is it for this file. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to support with a donation, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. I am spending a lot of time on this channel currently. It's time I can't do, other things like gainful work. So if you want to throw in a contribution, that's very encouraging and also helps materially. Otherwise, if you just want to support the channel without a donation, liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting is all helpful. We're also on Twitter at SocialismS4A. Until next time, thanks for whatever it is you do online and in your real-life community to oppose capital and advance the conversation about socialism. We'll catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2021 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook and discussion of Marxism and Revisionism by Lenin from 1908. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this text is the 14th in the Basic Marxism-Leninism Study Guide, which we've been publishing here on the channel over the last year and a half, along with many side readings and readings on other topics. It's a curriculum presented by an organization called MAI, Movimiento Antiimperialista, or Anti-Imperialist Movement. It's a good way to learn the principles of basic Marxism-Leninism, and again, we do many other works here on the channel to branch off of that and to deepen your knowledge. So I'll put a link to that playlist of the Basic Marxism-Leninism Study Guide in the video description, so check for that, as well as a link to the original text, as usual. So this piece was written not later than April 3rd, 1908. It was published in 1908 in the Symposium Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, signed V.L. Ilyin, published according to the Symposium. The source is Lenin, Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1973, Moscow, Volume 15. Transcription by Zodiac, HTML markup by Brian Baggins and D. Walters, and it's found online at the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. So, let's get into the text. There's a well-known saying that if geometrical axioms affected human interests, attempts would certainly be made to refute them. Theories of natural history, which conflicted with the old prejudices of theology, provoked and still provoke the most rabid opposition. Comment, still 100 years later, the same thing. No wonder, therefore, that the Marxian doctrine, which directly serves to enlighten and organize the advanced class in modern society, indicates the tasks facing this class and demonstrates the inevitable replacement, by virtue of economic development, of the present system by a new order. No wonder that this doctrine has had to fight for every step forward in the course of its life. Needless to say, this applies to bourgeois science and philosophy, officially taught by official professors, in order to befuddle the rising generation of the propertied classes, and to coach it against internal and foreign enemies. This science will not even hear of Marxism, declaring that it has been refuted and annihilated. Commenting again, Lenin was writing 100 years ago, and this never ended. The things you hear today, Marxism's dead, communism's dead, they were saying this back in Lenin's time, before the USSR was even founded. So take that for what it's worth when you hear it. Marx is attacked with equal zest by young scholars who are making a career by refuting socialism, and by decrepit elders who are preserving the tradition of all kinds of outworn systems. The progress of Marxism, the fact that its ideas are spreading and taking firm hold among the working class, inevitably increase the frequency and intensity of these bourgeois attacks on Marxism, which becomes stronger, more hardened, and more vigorous every time it is, quote, annihilated by official science. But even among doctrines connected with the struggle of the working class, and current mainly among the proletariat, Marxism by no means consolidated its position all at once. In the first half-century of its existence, from the 1840s on, Marxism was engaged in combating theories fundamentally hostile to it. In the early 1840s, Marx and Engels settled accounts with the radical young Hegelians, whose viewpoint was that of philosophical idealism. At the end of the 40s, the struggle began in the field of economic doctrine against Proudhonism. The 50s saw the completion of this struggle in criticism of the parties and doctrines which manifested themselves in the stormy year of 1848. In the 60s, the struggle shifted from the field of general theory to one closer to the direct labor movement, the ejection of Bakuниnism from the International. In the early 70s, the stage in Germany was occupied for a short while by the Proudhonist Mühlberger, and in the late 70s by the positivist Düring. But the influence of both on the proletariat was already absolutely insignificant. Marxism was already gaining an unquestionable victory over all other ideologies in the labor movement. By the 1890s, this victory was in the main completed. Even in the Latin countries, where the traditions of Proudhonism held their ground longest of all, The workers' parties, in effect, built their programs and their tactics on Marxist foundations. They revived international organization of the labor movement in the shape of periodical international congresses. From the outset, and almost without a struggle, adopted the Marxist standpoint in all essentials. But after Marxism had ousted all the more or less integral doctrines hostile to it, the tendencies expressed in those doctrines began to seek other channels. The forms and causes of the struggle changed, but the struggle continued. And the second half century of the existence of Marxism began, in the 90s, with the struggle of a trend hostile to Marxism within Marxism itself. Bernstein, a one-time orthodox Marxist, gave his name to this trend by coming forward with the most noise and with the most purposeful expression of amendments to Marx, revision of Marx, revisionism. Even in Russia where, owing to the economic backwardness of the country and the preponderance of a peasant population weighed down by the relics of serfdom, non-Marxist socialism has naturally held its ground longest of all. It is plainly passing into revisionism before our very eyes, both in the agrarian question, the program of the municipalization of all land, and in general questions of program and tactics. Our social narodniks are more and more substituting amendments to Marx for the moribund and obsolete remnants of their old system, which in its own way was integral and fundamentally hostile to Marxism. Pre-Marxist socialism has been defeated. It is continuing the struggle, no longer on its own independent ground, but on the general ground of Marxism as revisionism. So just a comment there, that's a really key point. So even by this time, what Marx and Engels set out to do, they basically went through all the utopian and idealist philosophies of progressive social change, which existed up to the 1840s. And they ruthlessly criticized them, and they subjected them to really rigorous analysis. And the result, what they felt would actually work in the end and was the strongest ideas which could hold up to all that analysis, they called scientific socialism, what we call Marxism today. So when Lenin says pre-Marxist socialism, it's all the stuff before Marx and Engels got their hands on it. So what he's saying here is that pre-Marxist socialism, although it's been defeated and it's just sort of like lingering on in the more backwards areas, it's still continuing the struggle, but no longer on its own independent ground, because its name, whatever the various different forms of these obsolete kinds of socialism were, they're now reappearing as, quote, Marxism. And Lenin is calling this revisionism because it's not Marxism. These are ideas that Marx and Engels rigorously criticized, and if there was anything of value, they kept it, otherwise they threw it out. But so these old bad ideas are popping back up again, calling themselves Marxist, but this is revisionism. So, continuing, let us then examine the ideological content of revisionism. In the sphere of philosophy, revisionism followed in the wake of bourgeois professorial, quote, science. The professors went back to Kant, and revisionism dragged along after the neo-Kantians. The professors repeated the platitudes that priests have uttered 1,000 times against philosophical materialism, and the revisionists, smiling indulgently, mumbled word for word after the latest Handbuch that materialism had been refuted, quote unquote, long ago. The professors treated Hegel as a dead dog, and while themselves preaching idealism, only an idealism 1,000 times more petty and banal than Hegel's, contemptuously shrugged their shoulders at dialectics, and the revisionists floundered after them into the swamp of philosophical vulgarization of science, replacing, quote, artful and revolutionary dialectics by, quote, simple and tranquil, quote, evolution. The professors earned their official salaries by adjusting both their idealist and their, quote, critical systems to the dominant medieval philosophy, i.e., theology, and the revisionists drew close to them, trying to make religion a, quote, private affair, not in relation to the modern state, but in relation to the party of the advanced class. What such, quote, amendments to Marx really meant in class terms need not be stated. It is self-evident. We shall simply note that the only Marxist in the international social democratic movement to criticize the incredible platitudes of the revisionists from the standpoint of consistent dialectical materialism was Plekhanov. This must be stressed all the more emphatically since profoundly mistaken attempts are being made at the present time to smuggle in old and reactionary philosophical rubbish disguised as a criticism of Plekhanov's tactical opportunism. There's a footnote there. See Studies in the Philosophy of Marxism by Bogdanov, Bazarov, and others. This is not the place to discuss the book, and I must at present confine myself to stating that in the very near future, I shall prove in a series of articles or in a separate pamphlet that everything I've said in the text about neo-Kantian revisionists essentially applies also to these, quote, new neo-humist and neo-Berkeleyan revisionists. Passing to political economy, it must be noted, first of all, that in this sphere, the amendments of the revisionists were much more comprehensive and circumstantial. Attempts were made to influence the public by, quote, new data on economic development. It was said that concentration and the ousting of small-scale production by large-scale production do not occur in agriculture at all, while they proceed very slowly in commerce and industry. It was said that crises had now become rarer and weaker, and that cartels and trusts would probably enable capital to eliminate them altogether. It was said that the, quote, theory of collapse to which capitalism is heading was unsound, owing to the tendency of class antagonisms to become milder and less acute. 2008. It was said, finally, that it would not be amiss to correct Marx's theory of value, too, in accordance with Bohm-Bawerk, footnote, an Austrian bourgeois economist. The fight against the revisionists on these questions resulted in as fruitful a revival of the theoretical thought in international socialism, as did Engels' controversy with Dühring 20 years earlier. The arguments of the revisionists were analyzed with the help of facts and figures. It was proved that the revisionists were systematically painting a rose-colored picture of modern small-scale production. The technical and commercial superiority of large-scale production over small-scale production, not only in industry, but also in agriculture, is proved by irrefutable facts. But commodity production is far less developed in agriculture, and modern statisticians and economists are, as a rule, not very skillful in picking out the special branches, sometimes even the operations, in agriculture, which indicate that agriculture is being progressively drawn into the process of exchange in world economy. Small-scale production maintains itself on the ruins of natural economy by constant worsening of diet, by chronic starvation, by lengthening of the working day, by deterioration in the quality and the care of cattle, in a word, by the very methods whereby handicraft production maintained itself against capitalist manufacture. Every advance in science and technology inevitably and relentlessly undermines the foundations of small-scale production in capitalist society, and it is the task of socialist political economy to investigate this process in all its forms, often complicated and intricate, and to demonstrate to the small producer the impossibility of his holding his own under capitalism, the hopelessness of peasant farming under capitalism, and the necessity for the peasant to adopt the standpoint of the proletarian. On this question, the revisionists sinned, in the scientific sense, by superficial generalizations based on facts selected one-sidedly and without reference to the system of capitalism as a whole. From the political point of view, they sinned by the fact that they inevitably, whether they wanted to or not, invited or urged the peasant to adopt the attitude of a small proprietor, i.e., the attitude of the bourgeoisie, instead of urging him to adopt the point of view of the revolutionary proletarian. The position of revisionism was even worse as regards the theory of crises and the theory of collapse. Only for a very short time could people, and then only the most short-sighted, think of refashioning the foundations of Marx's theory under the influence of a few years of industrial boom and prosperity. Realities very soon made it clear to the revisionists that crises were not a thing of the past. Prosperity was followed by a crisis. The forms, the sequence, the picture of particular crises changed, but crises remained an inevitable component of the capitalist system. While uniting production, the cartels, and trusts at the same time, and in a way that was obvious to all, aggravated the anarchy of production, the insecurity of existence of the proletariat, and the oppression of capital, thereby intensifying class antagonisms to an unprecedented degree. That capitalism is heading for a breakdown, in the sense both of individual political and economic crises, and of the complete collapse of the entire capitalist system, has been made particularly clear, and on a particularly large scale, precisely by the new giant trusts. The recent financial crisis in America, and the appalling increase of unemployment all over Europe, to say nothing of the impending industrial crisis to which many symptoms are pointing, all this has resulted in the recent theories of the revisionists having been forgotten by everybody, including, apparently, many of the revisionists themselves. But the lessons which this instability of the intellectuals had given the working class must not be forgotten. As to the theory of value, it need only be said that apart from the vaguest of hints and sighs, a la Bohm-Bawerk, the revisionists have contributed absolutely nothing, and have therefore left no traces whatsoever on the development of scientific thought. In the sphere of politics, revisionism did really try to revise the foundation of Marxism, namely the doctrine of the class struggle. Political freedom, democracy, and universal suffrage remove the ground for the class struggle, we were told, and render untrue the old proposition of the Communist Manifesto that the working men have no country. For, they said, since the, quote, will of the majority prevails in a democracy, one must neither regard the state as an organ of class rule, nor reject alliances with the progressive social reform bourgeoisie against the reactionaries. It cannot be disputed that these arguments of the revisionists amounted to a fairly well-balanced system of views, namely the old and well-known liberal bourgeois views. The liberals have always said that bourgeois parliamentarism destroys classes and class divisions, since the right to vote and the right to participate in the government of the country are shared by all citizens without distinction. The whole history of Europe in the second half of the 19th century and the whole history of the Russian Revolution in the early 20th clearly show how absurd such views are. Economic distinctions are not mitigated but aggravated and intensified under the freedom of, quote, democratic capitalism. Parliamentarism does not eliminate but lays bare the innate character even of the most democratic bourgeois republics as organs of class oppression, by helping to enlighten and to organize immeasurably wider masses of the population than those which previously took an active part in political events. Parliamentarism does not make for the elimination of crises and political revolutions, but for the maximum intensification of civil war during such revolutions. The events in Paris in the spring of 1871 and the events in Russia in the winter of 1905 showed as clearly as could be how inevitably this intensification comes about. The French bourgeoisie, without a moment's hesitation, made a deal with the enemy of the whole nation, with the foreign army which had ruined its country, in order to crush the proletarian movement. Whoever does not understand the inevitable inner dialectics of parliamentarism and bourgeois democracy, which leads to an even sharper decision of the argument by mass violence than formerly, will never be able, on the basis of this parliamentarism, to conduct propaganda and agitation consistent in principle, really preparing the working class masses for victorious participation in such, quote, arguments. The experience of alliances, agreements, and blocs with the social reform liberals in the West and with the liberal reformists, cadets, in the Russian Revolution, has convincingly shown that these agreements only blunt the consciousness of the masses, that they do not enhance but weaken the actual significance of their struggle, by linking fighters with elements who are least capable of fighting and most vacillating and treacherous. Millerandism in France, the biggest experiment in applying revisionist political tactics on a wide, a really national scale, has provided a practical appraisal of revisionism that will never be forgotten by the proletariat all over the world. A natural complement to the economic and political tendencies of revisionism was its attitude to the ultimate aim of the socialist movement. Quote, the movement is everything, the ultimate aim is nothing. This catchphrase of Bernstein's expresses the substance of revisionism better than many long disquisitions. To determine its conduct from case to case, to adapt itself to the events of the day and to the chopping and changing of petty politics, to forget the primary interests of the proletariat and the basic features of the whole capitalist system, all of capitalist evolution, to sacrifice these primary interests for the real or assumed advantages of the moment. Such is the policy of revisionism, and it patently follows from the very nature of this policy that it may assume an infinite variety of forms, and that every more or less, quote, new question, every more or less unexpected and unforeseen turn of events, even though it changes the basic line of development only to an insignificant degree and only for the briefest period, will always inevitably give rise to one variety of revisionism or another. The inevitability of revisionism is determined by its class roots in modern society. Revisionism is an international phenomenon. No thinking socialist who is in the least informed can have the slightest doubt that the relationship between the Orthodox and the Bernsteinians in Germany, the Guesdists and the Jarzists, and now particularly the Broussists in France, the Social Democratic Federation and the Independent Labour Party in Great Britain, Bruckner and Van der Velde in Belgium, the Integralists and the Reformists in Italy, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in Russia, is everywhere essentially similar, notwithstanding the immense variety of national conditions and historical factors in the present state of all these countries. In reality, the, quote, division within the present international socialist movement is now proceeding along the same lines in all the various countries of the world, which testifies to a tremendous advance compared with 30 or 40 years ago, when heterogeneous trends in the various countries were struggling within the one international socialist movement. And that, quote, revisionism from the left, which has taken shape in the Latin countries as, quote, revolutionary syndicalism, and there's a footnote there. Revolutionary syndicalism is a petty bourgeois, semi-anarchist trend that made its appearance in the labor movement of a number of West European countries at the close of the 19th century. The syndicalists saw no need for the working class to engage in political struggle. They repudiated the leading role of the party and the dictatorship of the proletariat. They believed that by organizing a general strike of the workers in the trade unions, in France, syndicats, could, without a revolution, overthrow capitalism and take control over production. So in the Latin countries, revolutionary syndicalism is also adapting itself to Marxism, quote, amending it. La Briola in Italy and Lagardelle in France frequently appeal from Marx who is understood wrongly to Marx who is understood rightly. We cannot stop here to analyze the ideological content of this revisionism, which as yet is far from having developed to the same extent as opportunist revisionism. It has not yet become international, has not yet stood the test of a single big practical battle with the Socialist Party in any single country. We confine ourselves, therefore, to that revisionism from the right, which was described above. Wherein lies its inevitability in capitalist society? Why is it more profound than the differences of national peculiarities and of degrees of capitalist development? Because in every capitalist country, side by side with the proletariat, there are always broad strata of the petty bourgeoisie, small proprietors. Capitalism arose and is constantly arising out of small production. A number of new middle strata are inevitably brought into existence again and again by capitalism. Appendages to the factory, work at home, small workshops scattered all over the country to meet the requirements of big industries such as the bicycle and automobile industries, etc. These new small producers are just as inevitably being cast again into the ranks of the proletariat. It is quite natural that the petty bourgeois world outlook should, again and again, crop up in the ranks of the broad workers' parties. It is quite natural that this should be so, and always will be so, right up to the changes of fortune that will take place in the proletarian revolution. For it would be a profound mistake to think that the, quote, complete proletarianization of the majority of the population is essential for bringing about such a revolution. So a comment there. In other words, what Lenin is saying is there may never be complete proletarianization because there are always small producers, starting up this little cottage industry or that, and then maybe that gets bought by some bigger bourgeois interest and then folded into large-scale production, etc. But basically, there's a big difference between when capitalism started, you know, and only 10% of the population or 20% were proletarians. And then as capitalism progressed, you got up to 80 or 90% are proletarians. That's the overall balance that we want to look at, whether 100%, you know, the difference between 99% and 100%, that's not really as significant as, you know, 30, 40%, up to 70, 80%. What you're looking at is a population that is, you know, overwhelmingly proletarian. Okay. What we now frequently experience only in the domain of ideology, namely disputes over theoretical amendments to Marx. What now crops up in practice only over individual side issues of the labor movement, as tactical differences with the revisionists and splits on this basis, is bound to be experienced by the working class on an incomparably larger scale when the proletarian revolution will sharpen all disputed issues, will focus all differences on points which are of the most immediate importance in determining the conduct of the masses, and will make it necessary in the heat of the fight to distinguish enemies from friends and to cast out bad allies in order to deal decisive blows to the enemy. The ideological struggle waged by revolutionary Marxism against revisionism at the end of the 19th century is but the prelude to the great revolutionary battles of the proletariat, which is marching forward to the complete victory of its cause, despite all the waverings and weaknesses of the petty bourgeoisie. So that's the end of the audiobook, and I'm going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a comment. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section below. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so thanks for that. If you'd like to help out without a donation, liking, subscribing, clicking the notifications bell, leaving a comment, and sharing these videos in your social media all help to expand the audience, broaden the conversation. Ultimately, whatever it is you do for the cause of socialism in your community and online, thanks for doing it. Join an organization if there's a good one in your area, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Lessons of the Commune by Lenin from 1908. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. So this piece was first published in Zagranichная Gazeta number 2, March 23, 1908, and published here according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 13. Translated by Bernard Isaacs, HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Marxists.org, thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So we begin with a note from MIA about this piece. It is the verbatim report of a speech made by Lenin. The editors of the newspaper introduced the article with the following remark. An international meeting was held in Geneva on March 18 to commemorate 3 proletarian anniversaries: the 25th anniversary of the death of Marx, the 60th anniversary of the March Revolution of 1848, and the anniversary of the Paris Commune. Comrade Lenin, on behalf of the RSDLP, spoke at the meeting on the significance of the Commune. And the Zagranichная Gazeta was a newspaper published by a group of Russian emigrants in Geneva from March to April 1908. So let's begin. After the coup d'etat, which marked the end of the revolution of 1848, France fell under the yoke of the Napoleonic regime for a period of 18 years. This regime brought upon the country not only economic ruin, but national humiliation. In rising against the old regime, the proletariat undertook 2 tasks, one of them national and the other of a class character: the liberation of France from the German invasion and the socialist emancipation of the workers from capitalism. This union of 2 tasks forms a unique feature of the Commune. The bourgeoisie had formed a government of national defense, and the proletariat had to fight for national independence under its leadership. Actually, it was a government of national betrayal, which saw its mission in fighting the Paris proletariat. But the proletariat, blinded by patriotic illusions, did not perceive this. The patriotic idea had its origins in the Great Revolution of the 18th century. It swayed the minds of the socialists of the Commune, and Blanqui, for example, undoubtedly a revolutionary and an ardent supporter of socialism, could find no better title for his newspaper than the bourgeois cry, "The country is in danger." Combining contradictory tasks, patriotism and socialism, was the fatal mistake of the French socialists. Let's read that sentence again. Combining contradictory tasks, patriotism and socialism, was the fatal mistake of the French socialists. In the Manifesto of the International, issued in September 1870, Marx had warned the French proletariat against being misled by a false national idea. The Great Revolution, class antagonisms had sharpened, and whereas at that time the struggle against the whole of European reaction united the entire revolutionary nation, now the proletariat could no longer combine its interests with the interests of other classes hostile to it. Let the bourgeoisie bear the responsibility for the national humiliation. The task of the proletariat was to fight for the socialist emancipation of labor from the yoke of the bourgeoisie. And indeed, the true nature of bourgeois patriotism was not long in revealing itself. Having concluded an ignominious peace with the Prussians, the Versailles government proceeded to its immediate task. It launched an attack to wrest the arms that terrified it from the hands of the Paris proletariat. The workers replied by proclaiming the Commune and civil war. Although the socialist proletariat was split up into numerous sects, the Commune was a splendid example of the unanimity with which the proletariat was able to accomplish the democratic tasks which the bourgeoisie could only proclaim. Without any particularly complex legislation, in a simple, straightforward manner, the proletariat, which had seized power, carried out the democratization of the social system, abolished the bureaucracy, and made all official posts elective. But two mistakes destroyed the fruits of this splendid victory. The proletariat stopped halfway. Instead of setting about expropriating the expropriators, it allowed itself to be led astray by dreams of establishing a higher justice in the country, united by a common national task. Such institutions as the banks, for example, were not taken over, and Proudhonist theories about a just exchange, etc., still prevailed among the socialists. The second mistake was excessive magnanimity on the part of the proletariat. Instead of destroying its enemies, it sought to exert moral influence on them. It underestimated the significance of direct military operations in civil war, and instead of launching a resolute offensive against Versailles that would have crowned its victory in Paris, it tarried and gave the Versailles government time to gather their dark forces and prepare for the blood-soaked week of May. But despite all its mistakes, the Commune was a superb example of the great proletarian movement of the 19th century. Marx set a high value on the historic significance of the Commune. If, during the treacherous attempt by the Versailles gang to seize the arms of the Paris proletariat, the workers had allowed themselves to be disarmed without a fight, the disastrous effect of the demoralization that this weakness would have caused in the proletarian movement would have been far, far greater than the losses suffered by the working class in the battle to defend its arms. Footnote there, for Marx's evaluation of the historical role of the Paris Commune as a forerunner of the new society, see the Civil War in France, and letters to Kugelmann for April 12 and 17, 1871. Back to the text. The sacrifices of the Commune, heavy as they were, are made up for by its significance for the general struggle of the proletariat. It stirred the socialist movement throughout Europe. It demonstrated the strength of civil war. It dispelled patriotic illusions and destroyed the naive belief in any efforts of the bourgeoisie for common national aims. The Commune taught the European proletariat to pose concretely the tasks of the socialist revolution. The lesson learned by the proletariat will not be forgotten. The working class will make use of it, as it has already done in Russia during the December uprising. The period that preceded the Russian Revolution and prepared it bears a certain resemblance to the period of the Napoleonic yoke in France. In Russia, too, the autocratic clique has brought upon the country economic ruin and national humiliation. But the outbreak of revolution was held back for a long time, since social development had not yet created the conditions for a mass movement. And, notwithstanding all the courage displayed, the isolated actions against the government in the pre-revolutionary period broke against the apathy of the masses. Only the Social Democrats, by strenuous and systematic work, educated the masses to the level of the higher forms of struggle, mass actions, and armed civil war. The Social Democrats were able to shatter the common national and patriotic delusions of the young proletariat, and later, when the manifesto of October 17th had been wrested from the Tsar due to their direct intervention, the proletariat began vigorous preparation for the next inevitable phase of the revolution, the armed uprising. Having shed common national illusions, it concentrated its class forces in its own mass organizations, the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, etc. And notwithstanding all the differences in the aims and tasks of the Russian Revolution, compared with the French Revolution of 1871, the Russian proletariat had to resort to the same method of struggle as that first used by the Paris Commune, civil war. Mindful of the lessons of the Commune, it knew that the proletariat should not ignore peaceful methods of struggle. They serve its ordinary day-to-day interests. They're necessary in periods of preparation for revolution, but it must never forget that in certain conditions the class struggle assumes the form of armed conflict and civil war. There are times when the interests of the proletariat call for ruthless extermination of its enemies in open armed clashes. This was first demonstrated by the French proletariat in the Commune, and brilliantly confirmed by the Russian proletariat in the December uprising. And although these magnificent uprisings of the working class were crushed, there will be another uprising, in face of which the forces of the enemies of the proletariat will prove ineffective, and from which the socialist proletariat will emerge completely victorious. That's the end of the audiobook. So I just want to point out that the Russian Revolution, Lenin writing in 1908 here, that he's talking about is the first Russian Revolution, period 1905 to 1907. This was sort of the big break of the bourgeoisie against the Tsar, and this resulted in the establishment of the Duma, the parliament, which at first was just advisory, etc. But it was a period of mass uprising and rebellion. Of course, Russia was sort of on the brink of feudalism and early capitalism, so it was more of a bourgeois revolution, but there was a lot of proletarian and peasant involvement. So much so that, of course, just about a decade later, there was the actual socialist revolution, which broke through the bourgeois lead and put the proletariat in the center of the revolution. All right, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons. Again, patreon.com/socialismforall is where you can support. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. I would make content even if nobody paid, but the financial support allows me to spend a lot more time on it, so that's much appreciated. Also, like, share, subscribe, because that helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm and helps YouTube to recommend this content to more people. Lastly, remember that the struggle goes on in real life, so while you can get a lot of education and have some discussion online, and that's great, you've really got to get out there, join your community organizations, support labor unions, tenant unions, anti-capitalist political parties, that definitely does not include the Democratic Party, and other workers' coalitions that you may find in your area. All right, thanks again, and we will see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2021 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook and discussion of The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution from 1909 by Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution was first published in Social Democrat numbers 3 and 4, March 9 and 21, 1909, signed N. Lenin, and published here according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1973, Volume 15. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's available online at the Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org. Please go check out MIA. They have thousands of free Marxist texts available in plain text format. You can easily download them to your hard drive or any other format that you like. So let's get into the audiobook. In the article printed above, Comrade Martov touches upon an extremely important question, or rather series of questions, concerning the aim the proletariat and the Social Democrats are fighting for in our revolution. Quick comment there, this is prior to the 1917 Russian Revolution, which not only overthrew the Tsar in February of that year, but during which the communists or Bolsheviks, Lenin's faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, eventually took power and began the construction of the Soviet Union. And at this time, it was prior to the split between the communists and the what we would today call social democrats, the Mensheviks. And at that time, social democracy referred to the overall Marxist trend, just to clarify on that. Continuing. He touches upon the history of the discussion of these questions in our party, upon their relation to the principles of Marxism and to Narodism, and upon all the shades of opinion that have been expressed on the subject. He touches upon all aspects of the question, but does not clear up a single one of them. To come to the nub of the matter, we must make a systematic survey of the question in all its aspects. Part 1. We shall begin with the history of the discussion of this question by the Russian Social Democrats. It was brought up by the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks at the beginning of 1905. Comment, that was the first Russian Revolution, which did not succeed at overthrowing the Tsar or capitalism, but did lead to the construction of the first Soviets, which of course would play a much larger role going forward. The former answered it with the formula, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. The latter flatly rejected this definition of the class content of a victorious bourgeois revolution. The Third Bolshevik Congress, held in London in May 1905, and the Menshevik Conference, held at the same time in Geneva, officially expressed the views of the two sections of the party. In keeping with the spirit of the times, both sections of the party in their resolutions dealt not with the theoretical and general question of the aim of the struggle and the class content of a victorious revolution in general, but with the narrow question of a provisional revolutionary government. The Bolshevik resolution read, quote, "The establishment of a democratic republic in Russia will be possible only as the result of a victorious popular uprising, whose organ will be a provisional revolutionary government, subject to the relation of forces and other factors which cannot be determined exactly beforehand. Representatives of our party may participate in the revolutionary provisional government for the purpose of waging a relentless struggle against all attempts at counter-revolution and of defending the independent interests of the working class," unquote. The Menshevik resolution read, quote, "Social democracy must not set out to seize power or share it with anyone in the provisional government, but must remain the party of extreme revolutionary opposition," unquote. It is evident from the above that the Bolsheviks themselves, at an all-Bolshevik Congress, did not include in their official resolution any such formula as the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, but stated only that it was permissible to participate in the provisional government, and that it was the mission of the proletariat to play the leading role, resolution on armed uprising. The, quote, formula, quote, "revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry," unquote, given in the Bolshevik press before the Third Congress, was repeated in the pamphlet Two Tactics after that Congress, and it never entered anybody's head to accuse the Bolsheviks of saying one thing in their resolutions and another thing in their commentaries. It never entered anybody's head to demand that the resolutions of a mass party engaged in political struggle should tally, word for word, with the formulas giving a Marxist definition of the class content of a victorious revolution. Another important conclusion to be drawn from our historical inquiry is this. In the spring of 1905, the key issue of the controversy for both sections of the party was the conquest of power by the proletariat and the revolutionary classes in general, and neither section went into the question of what the relations between these classes conquering power might or should be. As we've seen, the Mensheviks reject both the seizing and the sharing of power. This obviously goes on to this day, where today's Mensheviks, or social democrats we call them, want welfare capitalism. They leave capitalists in power, so workers don't seize power. They just leave capitalists in power and constrain them by, making demands or mass action or whatever. Point of fact, this was tried with the New Deal in the 1930s, etc. And what we found is that the capitalists quickly reasserted their power within a few decades, and we are now 4 decades into the full assertion of their power, that being neoliberalism. So For all the social democrats, Kyle Kulinski's, etc., railing against neoliberalism, it is literally your ideology which gave rise to it. Continuing. The Bolsheviks speak of the, quote, leading role of the proletariat in the revolution, in the resolution on the armed uprising, and say that social democrats may participate in a provisional government, that the, quote, independence of the Social Democratic Party, which aims at the complete socialist revolution, should be firmly safeguarded, unquote, from the resolution on the provisional revolutionary government, that the revolutionary movement of the peasants should be, quote, supported, that, quote, the revolutionary democratic content of the peasant movement should be cleared of reactionary impurities, unquote, that, quote, the revolutionary consciousness of the peasants should be developed and their democratic demands carried to their logical conclusion, unquote. This is from the resolution on the attitude to be adopted to the peasant movement. The resolutions of the Bolshevik Congress of 1905 contain no other formulas on the relations between the proletariat and the peasantry. Now let us take the draft resolutions of the two sections a year later, before the Stockholm Congress. These drafts are often forgotten or ignored in the press in general, and in our party in particular. That is a great pity, for their significance in the history of the tactical principles of social democracy is enormous. It is these draft resolutions which show what lessons the two sections of the party drew from the experience of the struggles of October and December 1905. The Bolsheviks, in their draft resolution on the class aims of the proletariat, write, quote, only the proletariat can bring the democratic revolution to its consummation, the condition being that the proletariat, as the only thoroughly revolutionary class in modern society, leads the mass of the peasantry and imparts political consciousness to its spontaneous struggle against landed proprietorship and the feudal state, unquote. Repeated in the draft resolution for the London Congress, see Proletariat number 14, March 1907. Thus, the formula which the Bolsheviks here chose for themselves reads, the proletariat leading the peasantry. The Bolshevik resolutions contain no other formula to express the idea of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. This fact cannot be too strongly emphasized, for it is in the hope of its being forgotten or ignored that Comrade Martov attempts to place the resolution adopted at the December conference of 1908 in a totally false light. The Mensheviks say in their draft resolution that it is the task of the proletariat, quote, to be the driving force of the bourgeois revolution. Please note, not the leader, not the guide, as the Bolshevik resolution says, but the, quote, driving force. And among the tasks enumerated is that of, quote, supporting by mass pressure such oppositional steps of the bourgeois Democrats as do not clash with the demands in our program, as may promote their fulfillment and become the point of departure for the further advancement of the revolution, unquote. Thus, the difference between them is reduced by the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks themselves to the alternative, leader and guide of the revolution, who leads the peasantry, or, quote, driving force of the revolution, which, quote, supports the various steps taken by the bourgeois Democrats. We would add that the Mensheviks, who were the victors at the Stockholm Congress, themselves withdrew this resolution in spite of the protests and insistence of the Bolsheviks. Why did the Mensheviks do it? The reader will find the answer to this question when he reads the following passage from the same Menshevik draft resolution. Quote, the proletariat can properly fulfill its task as the driving force of the bourgeois revolution only by organizing itself while at the same time drawing more and more new sections of the town bourgeoisie and the peasantry into the revolutionary struggle, democratizing their demands, stimulating them to organize, and thereby paving the way for the victory of the revolution, unquote. This is obviously a half-hearted concession to the Bolsheviks, for the proletariat is depicted not only as a driving force, but to some extent, at least, as a leader, because it draws and, quote, stimulates the peasantry and new sections of the town bourgeoisie. To proceed, on the question of the provisional government, the Menshevik draft resolution reads, quote, in the event of a general revolutionary upsurge in the country, the Social Democrats must everywhere promote the formation of Soviets of Workers' Deputies, stimulate other revolutionary democratic elements to form similar bodies, promote the union of all these bodies into general, non-party organizations of popular revolutionary struggle, putting before them those general national tasks of the revolution, which from the proletarian point of view can and should be fulfilled at the given stage of the revolution, unquote. This forgotten draft resolution of the Mensheviks clearly shows that the experience of October-December 1905 completely bewildered the Mensheviks, who surrendered their position to the Bolsheviks. Indeed, is the passage quoted above compatible with the following point in the same draft? Quote, the Social Democrats must not set out to seize power and establish a dictatorship in the present bourgeois revolution, unquote. This last proposition is quite consistent in principle and, except where it refers to sharing power, is an exact repetition of the resolution of 1905. But it hopelessly contradicts the lessons of October-December 1905, which the Mensheviks themselves reduced to the union of all bodies of the proletariat and, quote, other revolutionary democratic elements into, quote, general non-party organizations of popular revolutionary struggle. If the Soviets of Workers' Deputies unite with similar revolutionary democratic bodies into non-party organizations of popular revolutionary struggle, it is obvious that the proletariat does set out to, quote, seize power and establish a dictatorship, that it is taking part in such seizure of power. The resolution itself says that the, quote, main object of the revolution is to, quote, wrest political power from the hands of the reactionary government. Although shying at the words seizure of power and dictatorship and renouncing these terrible things in the most emphatic manner, the Mensheviks were forced to admit after 1905 that, quote, the union of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies with, quote, similar revolutionary democratic bodies followed logically from this course of events, and that this union must result in the formation of, quote, general non-party, parentheses, this is not quite correct, it should have read non-party or inter-party, quote, organizations of popular revolutionary struggle, unquote. But this general organization is nothing else than a provisional revolutionary government. Quick comment there. Imagine if people in the United States had the courage to speak in these terms. Imagine that. Continuing. Afraid to use the exact and direct term, the Mensheviks replaced it by a description, but that does not alter matters. Quote, an organ of popular revolutionary struggle that, quote, wrests political power from the hands of the old government is nothing more nor less than a provisional revolutionary government. While the Mensheviks had to take into account the lessons of October-December 1905, after much blundering and stumbling, the Bolsheviks arrived at their conclusions directly and clearly. The Bolshevik draft resolution on the provisional government declares, quote, in this open struggle at the end of 1905, those elements among the local population who were capable of determined action against the old regime, parentheses, almost exclusively the proletariat and the advanced sections of the petty bourgeoisie, were impelled by necessity to set up organizations which were in effect the rudiments of a new revolutionary authority. The Soviets of Workers' Deputies in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and other cities, the Soviets of Soldiers' Deputies in Vladivostok, Krasnoyarsk, etc., the Railwaymen's Committees in Siberia and in the south, the Peasant Committees in Saratov, Gubernia, the Revolutionary City Committees in Novorossiysk and elsewhere, and lastly, the elected rural bodies in the Caucasus and the Baltic region, unquote. The failure of these bodies was due to their disunited and rudimentary state, we read further, while the provisionary revolutionary government is defined as the, quote, organ of victorious uprising. The resolution goes on to say, quote, in order to carry the revolution through to victory, the proletariat is now faced with the urgent task of promoting, jointly with the revolutionary Democrats, the unification of the insurrection and of forming a coordinating center for this insurrection in the shape of a provisional revolutionary government, unquote. Then follows an almost verbatim repetition of the resolution passed by the Third Congress in 1905. These quotations from the draft resolutions of the two sections before the Stockholm Congress enable us to put the question of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry on a concrete historical basis. Anyone who desires to give a clear and straightforward answer to this question must take into account the experience at the end of 1905. Those who evade examining this experience will not only be ignoring material of the utmost value to a Russian Marxist, they will furthermore inevitably doom themselves to the pettifogging interpretation of formulas, to slurring over and pasting over, to use Comrade Martov's apt expression, disagreements on matters of principle, and to that very unprincipled floundering on questions of the theory and practice of dictatorship that is expressed best of all by the formula, quote, "The movement is everything, the ultimate aim, nothing," unquote. There's a footnote off of that. Quote, "The movement is everything, the ultimate aim, nothing," was the formula advanced by E. Bernstein, leader of the extreme opportunist wing of the German Social Democrats and the Second International, and the theoretician of revisionism and reformism. Continuing with the main text. The experience of the end of 1905 has undoubtedly proved that, quote, "a general revolutionary upsurge in the country produces special, quote, organizations of popular revolutionary struggle, according to the Menshevik formula, or, quote, rudimentary organs of a new revolutionary authority, according to that of the Bolsheviks. It is equally beyond doubt that in the history of the Russian bourgeois revolution, these organs were created, first by the proletariat, and secondly, quote, by other revolutionary democratic elements. And a simple reference to the composition of the population of Russia in general, and of Great Russia in particular, will show that the peasantry represent the vast majority of these other elements. Lastly, no less beyond doubt is the historical tendency of these local bodies or organizations to amalgamate. The conclusion that inevitably follows from these undoubted facts is that a victorious revolution in present-day Russia cannot be anything but the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Nobody can get away from this inevitable conclusion except by pettifogging and pasting over disagreements. If fragments of the question are not torn from their context, if town and country and the various localities are not artificially and arbitrarily separated, if the question of the composition of this or that government is not substituted for the question of the dictatorship of classes, in short, if the question is examined as a whole, then nobody can prove by concrete examples taken from the experience of 1905 that a victorious revolution could be anything other than the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. But before going any further, let us finish with the party history of the formula we are examining. We have seen how the two sections precisely formulated their views in 1905 and in 1906. In 1907, on the eve of the London Congress, the Mensheviks first proposed one draft resolution on the attitude toward the bourgeois parties. This is in Narodnaya Duma, 1907, number 12. And at the Congress itself, they proposed another. The first draft talks about, quote, combining the actions of the proletariat with the actions of the other classes. The second talks about, quote, utilizing the movement of other classes, quote, for the aims of the proletariat, and about, quote, support by the proletariat of certain, quote, oppositional and revolutionary steps made by other classes, and about social democrats entering into, quote, agreements with the liberal and democratic classes in, quote, certain definite cases. The Bolshevik draft, like the resolution adopted by the London Congress, says that the Social Democrats should, quote, compel them, meaning the Narodnik or Trudovik parties, quote, which more or less closely express the interests and the viewpoint of the broad mass of the peasants and the town petty bourgeoisie, unquote, to side with the Social Democrats against the Black Hundreds and the Cadets, unquote, and that the, quote, joint actions following from this should, quote, serve only to promote a general onset. The resolution as adopted by the Congress differs from the Bolshevik draft in that it contains the additional words inserted on the initiative of a Polish delegate, quote, in the struggle to carry the revolution through to victory. This, once again, most clearly reaffirmed the idea of the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, for such a dictatorship is, quote, joint action by these classes which have, quote, carried or are carrying the revolution through to victory. That's the end of section 1. Moving on to section 2 of The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution by Lenin, 1909. We have only to take a general glance at the history of party opinions on the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry to to see how much damage Comrade Martov has done himself by his talk about pettifogging and movements without a goal. Indeed, the first thing that this history shows is that the Bolsheviks themselves have never, either in their drafts or their resolutions, inserted the expression or, quote, formula, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Nevertheless, up till now, no one has ever thought of denying that all the Bolshevik drafts and resolutions between 1905 and 1907 are based entirely on the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. It would be absurd to deny it, for to do so would indeed be pettifoggery and an attempt to obscure the real issue with a mere quibbling over words. The proletariat which, quote, allies to itself the mass of the peasantry, said Lenin in Two Tactics. The proletariat which, quote, leads the mass of the peasantry, says the draft resolution of the Bolsheviks in 1906, quote, joint actions of the proletariat and the peasantry, quote, in the struggle to carry the democratic revolution through to victory, unquote, says the resolution of the London Congress. Is it not obvious that the same idea runs through all these formulations, that this idea is precisely the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, that the, quote, formula, the proletariat relying upon the peasantry, remains part and parcel of that same dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry? Comrade Martov tries his hardest to confute this latter proposition. He starts a discussion about the word and. There is no and. The formula with and in it was rejected, exclaims Comrade Martov. Don't dare now to put this and into unsigned articles in the central organ. Too late, dear Comrade Martov. You should have addressed this demand to all the Bolshevik organs of the press during the whole period of the revolution. All of them, all the time, spoke about the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, and did so on the basis of resolutions which did not contain this and. Comrade Martov has lost this battle over the word and he has lost it not only because it was belated, but also because Her Majesty Logic has ruled that allying to and leading and joint actions and relying upon and with the help of, this last expression occurring in the resolution of the 6th Congress of the Polish Social Democrats, all come within the meaning of the offending and. But the Bolsheviks objected to, quote, relying upon, says Comrade Martov, continuing his debate on principles. Yes, they did object, not because it controverted the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, but because in Russian this formula does not sound very well. Usually it is the weak who rely on the strong. The Bolsheviks are quite willing to accept word for word the Polish formula, quote, the proletariat with the help of the peasantry. Although perhaps it would have been better to say the proletariat leading the peasantry. One may argue about all these formulas, but to convert such an argument into a, quote, debate on principles is simply ridiculous. Comrade Martov's attempt to deny that, quote, relying upon is part of the concept of joint action is a model of pettifoggery. Comrade Martov quotes Don, Axelrod, and Semyonov as saying that the conquest of power, quote, by the proletariat, relying upon the peasantry, means conquest of power by, quote, the proletariat alone. But this can only make the reader smile. If we were to say that Martov and Patrusov, relying upon Cherevanin, Prokopovich, and company, have liquidated the idea of the hegemony of the proletariat in this revolution, would anyone take that to mean that Martov and Patrusov liquidated this idea alone without Cherevanin, Prokopovich, and company? No, comrades. A discussion in the central organ should not be reduced to pettifoggery. Such methods will not help you to wriggle out of admitting the fundamental and undoubted fact that the majority of the RSDLP, including the Poles and the Bolsheviks, stand firmly for one, recognition of the guiding role of the proletariat, the role of leader in the revolution; two, recognition that the aim of the struggle is the conquest of power by the proletariat, assisted by other revolutionary classes; three, recognition that the first and perhaps the sole, quote, assistants in this matter are the peasants. Those who want to discuss the real issue should try to challenge at least one of these three propositions. Comrade Martov has not examined a single one of them seriously. He forgot to tell his readers that on each of these three formulas, the Mensheviks hold a view which the party has rejected, and that Menshevism and Menshevism alone is the delusion which the party has rejected. And that was what the Mensheviks' policy was during the revolution, a movement without a goal, and therefore dependent on the vagaries of the Constitutional Democratic Party. Comment, boy, does this sound familiar in the US today. And this was the case precisely because the Mensheviks did not know whether the proletariat should aspire to be the leader, whether it should aspire to the conquest of power, and whether in doing so it should rely on the assistance of any other particular class. This ignorance inevitably dooms the Social Democrats' policy to uncertainty, error, sacrifice of principle, and dependence on the liberals. The conference did not bury, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, and did not authorize its elimination from the party's vocabulary. On the contrary, the conference endorsed it and took another step towards its fuller recognition. The London Congress recognized, 1, the role of the proletariat as, quote, leader in the bourgeois democratic revolution, and 2, joint actions of the proletariat and the peasantry, which were to, quote, serve only for the purpose of a general onset. Actions, too, by the way, for, quote, carrying the revolution through to victory. All that remained was to recognize that the aim of the struggle in this revolution was the conquest of power by the proletariat and the peasantry. This the conference did in the formula, quote, a conquest of power by the proletariat relying on the peasantry. In saying this, we do not in the least deny or play down differences of opinion between the Bolsheviks and the Poles. The Polish Social Democrats have every opportunity to voice these differences in their own publications in the Russian language, in the columns of the Bolshevik press, and in the central organ. The Polish Social Democrats have already begun to avail themselves of this opportunity. If Comrade Martov achieves his object and succeeds in bringing the Polish Social Democrats into our dispute, each and all will see that we are at one with the Polish Social Democrats against the Mensheviks on all essentials, and that we disagree only on minor points. And that's the end of section 2. Now heading into section 3 of The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution by Lenin, 1909. As for Trotsky, whom Comrade Martov has involved in the controversy of third parties which he has organized, a controversy involving everybody except the dissentient, we positively cannot go into a full examination of his views here. A separate article of considerable length would be needed for this. By just touching upon Trotsky's mistaken views and quoting scraps of them, Comrade Martov only sows confusion in the mind of the reader, for scraps of quotations do not explain, but confuse matters. Trotsky's major mistake is that he ignores the bourgeois character of the revolution and has no clear conception of the transition from this revolution to the socialist revolution. This major mistake leads to those mistakes on side issues, which Comrade Martov repeats when he quotes a couple of them with sympathy and approval. Not to leave matters in the confused state to which Comrade Martov has reduced them by his exposition, we shall at least expose the fallacy of those arguments of Trotsky, which have won the approval of Comrade Martov. Coalition of the proletariat and the peasantry, quote, presupposes either that the peasantry will come under the sway of one of the existing bourgeois parties, or that it will form a powerful independent party, unquote. This is obviously untrue, both from the standpoint of general theory and from that of the experience of the Russian Revolution. A, quote, coalition of classes does not at all presuppose either the existence of any particular powerful party or parties in general. This is only confusing classes with parties. A, quote, coalition of the specified classes does not in the least imply either that one of the existing bourgeois parties will establish its sway over the peasantry, or that the peasants should form a powerful independent party. Theoretically, this is clear because first, the peasants do not lend themselves very well to party organization, and because secondly, the formation of peasant parties is an extremely difficult and lengthy process in a bourgeois revolution, so that a, quote, powerful independent party may emerge only towards the end of the revolution. The experience of the Russian Revolution shows that, quote, coalitions of the proletariat amid the peasantry were formed scores and hundreds of times in the most diverse forms without any, quote, powerful independent party of the peasantry. Such a coalition was formed when there was, quote, joint action between, say, a Soviet of workers' deputies and a Soviet of soldiers' deputies, or a railwaymen's strike committee, or peasants' deputies, etc. All these organizations were mainly non-party. Nevertheless, every joint action between them undoubtedly represented a, quote, coalition of classes. In the course of this, a peasant party took shape as an idea, in germ, coming into being in the form of the Peasant Union of 1905, or the Trudovik Group of 1906, and as such, a party grew, developed, and constituted itself. The coalition of classes assumed different forms, from the vague and unofficial to definite and official political agreements. And there's a footnote there in the text about the All-Russian Peasant Union. This was a revolutionary democratic organization founded in 1905. Its program and tactics were elaborated at its first and second congresses held in Moscow in August and November 1903. The union demanded political liberty and the immediate convocation of a constituent assembly. It adopted the tactics of boycott of the First Duma. Its agrarian program called for the abolition of private land ownership and for the transfer of monastery, church, crown, and state lands to the peasants without compensation. The union pursued a vacillating middle-of-the-road policy. While demanding abolition of the landed estates, it agreed to partial compensation for the landlords. The peasant union was subjected to police persecutions from the moment it came into existence. It finally broke up at the beginning of 1907. Continuing with the text. After the dissolution of the First Duma, for example, the following three calls for insurrection were issued. 1. To the army and navy. 2. To all the Russian peasants. 3. To the whole people. The first was signed by the Social Democratic Group in the Duma and the Committee of the Trudovik Group. Comment here, the Duma is the Russian parliament, in case you're unfamiliar with that. Was this joint action evidence of a coalition of two classes? Of course it was. To deny it means to engage in pettifoggery, or to transform the broad scientific concept of a coalition of classes into a narrow juridical concept, almost that, I would say, of a notary. Further, can it be denied that this joint call for insurrection, signed by the Duma deputies of the working class and peasantry, was accompanied by joint actions of representatives of both classes in the form of partial local insurrections? Can it be denied that a joint call for a general insurrection and joint participation in local and partial insurrections necessarily implies the joint formation of a provisional revolutionary government? To deny it would mean to engage in pettifoggery, to reduce the concept of government to something completely and formally constituted, to forget that the complete and formally constituted develop from the incomplete and unconstituted. To proceed. The second call for insurrection was signed by the Central Committee, Menshevik, of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and also the Central Committee of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the All-Russian Peasant Union, the All-Russian Railwaymen's, and the All-Russian Teachers' Unions, as well as by the Committee of the Trudovik Group and the Social Democratic Group in the Duma. The third call for insurrection bears the signatures of the Polish Socialist Party and the Bund, plus all the foregoing signatures except the three unions. And there's a footnote there about the Bund, which was the General Jewish Workers' Union of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. It was formed by a founding congress of Jewish social democratic groups held in Vilna in 1897. It was an association mainly of semi-proletarian Jewish artisans in the western regions of Russia. The Bund joined the RSDLP at the first Congress, 1898, quote, as an autonomous organization, independent only in respect of questions affecting the Jewish proletariat specifically. The Bund brought nationalism and separatism into the working class movement of Russia. Its fourth Congress, held in April 1901, resolved to alter the organizational relations with the RSDLP established by the latter's first Congress. The resolution said that the Congress regarded the RSDLP as a federation of national organizations and that the Bund should be treated as a member of that federation. After the second Congress of the RSDLP had rejected its demand that it be recognized as the sole representative of the Jewish proletariat, the Bund left the party. In 1906, the Bund re-entered the RSDLP on the basis of a resolution of the Fourth Unity Congress. Within the RSDLP, the Bundists persistently supported the opportunist wing of the party, the economists, Mensheviks, and liquidators. and opposed the Bolsheviks and Bolshevism. The Bund countered the Bolsheviks' programmatic demand for the right of nations to self-determination by a demand for cultural national autonomy. During the period of the Stolypin reaction, 1907 to 10, it adopted a liquidationist stand and was active in forming the August anti-party bloc. During the First World War, 1914 to 18, it adopted the position of the social chauvinists. In 1917, it supported the bourgeois provisional government and fought on the side of the enemies of the October Socialist Revolution. In the years of foreign military intervention and civil war, the Bund leadership joined forces with the counter-revolution. At the same time, a change was taking place among the rank and file of the Bund in favor of collaboration with the Soviet power. In March 1921, the Bund decided to dissolve itself, and some of its members joined the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, according to general procedure. Back to the main text. That was a fully constituted political coalition of parties and non-party organizations. That was, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, proclaimed in the form of a threat to Tsarism, in the form of a call to the whole people, but not yet realized. And today, one will hardly find many social democrats who would agree with the Menshevik Social Democrat of 1906, number 6, which wrote of these appeals, quote, in this case, our party concluded with other revolutionary parties and groups, not a political bloc, but a fighting agreement, which we have always considered expedient and necessary, unquote. A fighting agreement cannot be contraposed to a political bloc, for the latter concept embraces the former. A political bloc at various historical moments takes the form either of, quote, a fighting agreement in connection with insurrection, or of a parliamentary agreement for, quote, joint action against the Black Hundreds and cadets, and so on. The idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry has found its practical expression throughout our revolution in 1,000 forms, from the signing of the manifesto calling upon the people to pay no taxes and to withdraw their deposits from the savings banks, December 1905, or the signing of calls to insurrection, July 1906, to voting in the second and third Dumas in 1907 and 1908. Trotsky's second statement, quoted by Comrade Martov, is wrong too. It is not true that, quote, the whole question is who will determine the government's policy, who will constitute a homogeneous majority in it, unquote, and so forth. And it is particularly untrue when Comrade Martov uses it as an argument against the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Trotsky himself, in the course of his argument, concedes that, quote, representatives of the democratic population will take part in the, quote, workers' government, i.e. concedes that there will be a government consisting of representatives of the proletariat and the peasantry. On what terms the proletariat will take part in the government of the revolution is quite another question, and it is quite likely that on this question the Bolsheviks will disagree not only with Trotsky, but also with the Polish Social Democrats. The question of the dictatorship of the revolutionary classes, however, cannot be reduced to a question of the, quote, majority in any particular revolutionary government, or of the terms on which the participation of the Social Democrats in such a government is admissible. Lastly, the most fallacious of Trotsky's opinions that Comrade Martov quotes and considers to be, quote, just, is the third, viz., quote, even if they, the peasantry, do this, quote, support the regime of working class democracy, with no more political understanding than they usually support a bourgeois regime, unquote. The proletariat cannot count on the ignorance and prejudices of the peasantry as the powers that be under a bourgeois regime count and depend on them, nor can it assume that in time of revolution the peasantry will remain in their usual state of political ignorance and passivity. The history of the Russian Revolution shows that the very first wave of the upsurge at the end of 1905 at once stimulated the peasantry to form a political organization, the All-Russian Peasant Union, which was undoubtedly the embryo of a distinct peasant party, both in the first and second Dumas, in spite of the fact that the counter-revolution had wiped out the first contingents of advanced peasants. The peasantry, now for the first time acting on a nationwide scale in the Russian general elections, immediately laid the foundations of the Trudovik group, which was undoubtedly the embryo of a distinct peasant party. In these embryos and rudiments, there was much that was unstable, vague, and vacillating. That is beyond doubt. But if political groups like this could spring up at the beginning of the revolution, there cannot be the slightest doubt that a revolution carried to such a, quote, conclusion, or rather, to such a high stage of development as a revolutionary dictatorship, will produce a more definitely constituted and stronger revolutionary peasant party. To think otherwise would be like supposing that some vital organs of an adult can retain the size, shape, and development of infancy.
So, my name is Dan. This has been my daily routine of meditation, yoga, martial arts, and reading. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you're just tuning in, go back to the beginning and have a nice daily routine to make you strong in body and mind for the day. Please like, share, and subscribe.